I'm Jim Marshall. I'm the president of the Institute of Peace, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here today to discuss this very important subject. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of the Institute, in essence, globally around the world, we work to stop fights. It's not like working to stop a fight on a playground or something like that. It's collective violence, takes very different techniques. And one of the things that we're very well aware of is that water will be a source for violence, already is a source for violence globally, and will continue to be a source for violence globally. I want to start with a little personal anecdote. My father was a Corps of Engineers officer throughout his career, as was my grandfather. And my father's final assignment was in Vicksburg, where he was president of the Mississippi River Commission, and among other things, in charge of what I think was then called the Waterways Experimental Station. The Waterways Experimental Station studied waterways in the United States and made predictions concerning water and water use and water needs throughout the United States. So I mentioned to my dad that I was thinking about moving to Georgia, and he said, "Great, let me check with my folks." Gets back with me and he says, "Good choice, you're not going to have any water issues in Georgia." Now let's see. While I was, just before I was the mayor of Macon, we had what was described as a 500-year flood. We lost water in the city for 23 days. We're intermittently subject to water restrictions, water drought. Many of you know about the dispute concerning the Chattahoochee and the water consumption in Atlanta. So the Waterways Experimental Station was not very predictive of what happened in Georgia, where water is concerned. The Waterways Experimental Station, I understand, has now sort of expanded, renamed, and is global in its reach, and it's studying water issues throughout the world. We are in lots of different places, and in many of those places, as I mentioned, water is a big issue. We expect, for example, that in Pakistan, as the years progress, it will be the primary driver of conflict. And so it's very appropriate that the Association of the United States Army, led by Gordon Sullivan, General Gordon Sullivan, and the U.S. Water Partnership, led by Ambassador Babbitt, combine with the Institute of Peace to try and address this subject, figure out what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and how to move forward in developing the right kind of public and private partnerships to minimize the likelihood that there will be violence and maximize the likelihood that water could conceivably be used to settle disputes as opposed to causing disputes. Today our keynote speaker is Lieutenant General Tom Bostick, and he's going to be introduced by Gordon Sullivan. I'd like to recognize, though, that we have an Army fellow with us who is related to Tom Bostick. Colonel Tony Bostick is here with us, and he's with the Institute for a year. So we're happy to have you, and we're happy to have you, sir. And with that, let me ask General Sullivan to come up. Great leader with the United States Army as Chief of Staff at one point, and a terrific leader for the Association of the United States Army, a good friend of the Institute, Gordon Sullivan.
Thanks very much, Jim, for that kind introduction. I want to thank the USIP team for allowing us to use this lovely facility. It's always inspirational to come here, and I think it's a tribute to lots of people who made it possible, some of whom were criticized for doing so, but they stuck with it. And I think we have just a wonderful facility here. And I'd like to acknowledge the U.S. Water Partnership, Ambassador Babbitt, and thank the sponsors, the McWane Foundation. Mr. Ruffner Page is here. Acknowledge him, and the Tara Foundation, Ms. Maggie Bryant. Thanks to them and their generous support in making this inaugural Water Security Council Conflict Prevention Summit possible. How about a nice hand for them? I don't want to speak for any of the other sponsors, but I, for one, could not have predicted and would not have predicted such a turnout. And I think it is a manifestation of something that certainly many of us have felt for some time is very important and underappreciated, and that is the power of fresh, clean water. And frankly, shortages of it, a source of deadly conflict. Equally important to their support, by the way, is the intellectual energy which will be derived from this conference and the fora which exists after it. Now, I'm encouraged by the breadth and diversity of our participants and excited by the potential to develop public-private partnerships, and this is certainly a pretty good example of that, and integrated solutions to water security challenges around the world. In particular, this instance, it's been apparent that access to fresh water is becoming a source of conflict, and smart and enlightened water diplomacy offers a tool to promote water security by opening negotiations and dialogue for cooperations and among states and addressing asymmetries in resources of power and drinking water and water for life. I was, just a small diversion, I was involved in the activities in Rwanda in the early 90s, and it was amazing to me that clean, fresh water caused the dying to drop like a rock, more so than food and other amenities of life. Clean, fresh water. And it was apparent when we saw the trend lines, how important it was to life. Appropriate diplomatic and developmental efforts will de-escalate disputes over contested water resources, and our armed forces, in some cases, do play an important role in these matters. And we're going to hear from our keynote speaker now, who represents just one of the many important activities of the U.S. government, the general contractor, really, for the United States of America, the Army Corps of Engineers. Its Chief, Lieutenant General Tom Bostick. And we will also hear from the Chief Army Reserve, Lieutenant General Jeff Talley, later this morning. General Talley, in addition to his duties as a reserve officer, has vast experience in this area in his civilian life, demonstrating the relationship of public-private partnerships. It's my pleasure now to introduce our keynote speaker, Lieutenant General Tom Bostick. He became the 53rd Chief of Engineers and Commanding General of the United States Army Corps of Engineers in May of 2012. Many of you may know that the Army Corps of Engineers is the largest U.S. government agency involved in the management of water resources. And you might have read, interestingly enough, in the Washington Post this weekend, two articles on one page talking about activities of the Corps of Engineers. One is the Shenandoah watershed and issues related to the exploration of natural gas out in the important Shenandoah Valley, and the Washington Aqueduct, which provides water to the District of Columbia, which has been a part of the Corps' responsibility for over 100 years, well over 100 years. As the Chief of the Corps, General Bostick is responsible for 37,000 military and civilian personnel who provide project management and construction support for the Army and Air Force installations in more than 100 countries around the world. He is responsible for hundreds of environmental projects and programs, including the regulatory permit program to protect, restore, and enhance thousands of acres of wetlands. The Corps also heads up public works and engineering restoration and repair for FEMA Federal Emergency Management Agency, and you see him and his people, hurricanes, floods, droughts, and so forth and so on. As a matter of fact, I would point out that the Mississippi was drying up, and 3 months later it was flooded, so in the same year. And you saw his people involved with that. He graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point, holds a master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford University, and he served in numerous command positions around the world, both at the tactical and strategic level in peace and war. How about a nice hand for the Chief of the Corps of Engineers, Lieutenant General Tom Bostick.
Well, sir, thanks for those kind words, kind introduction. You know, General Sullivan has been a mentor for senior leaders in the Army. Ever since he left, he was doing it all throughout his Army career, but he still does it for us these days. So when I became the G1 of the Army, I was the head of Human Resources, 1 million soldiers, 300,000 civilians, and he called me in, and he knew we were getting ready to go through a drawdown, and he and General Vono had experience with that, and he's always trying to help, and I think he knew what I was going to come in and talk about, and you know, and I came in, I was wringing my hands, and I said, you know, General Sullivan, I'm going to have to draw the Army down in 80,000 soldiers in 5 years. And that's like 15,000 or so every year. This is going to be hard. We're at war. And Vono said, well, Tom, you know, I had a plan to draw down the Army 35,000 soldiers in every 3 years and take down the Army 100,000. And then Desert Shield, Desert Storm hit, and we stopped any drawdown. And then General Sullivan came in, President Clinton came in, and General Sullivan got told to take the Army down 100,000 soldiers in 1 year. So I did an about face, and I walked out, and I said, I don't have a problem. But, you know, so I learned my lesson. When I became chief engineers, I walked in, and I knew I had to throw a hard one at him this time. And General Sullivan said, Tom, I want to help you. What can I help you with? And I said, sir, water. You know, we got a real challenge in not only our nation, but internationally with water scarcity, the challenges that conflict might bring with water, and I think the international community, folks like the Institute of Peace, and all of those that have come together today have a great interest in that. So I would like to first thank Congressman Jim Marshall, President of the U.S. Institute of Peace, for the invitation to speak today. I want to thank Ambassador Hattie Babbitt, Chair of the U.S. Water Partnership, and I want to thank AUSA for coming together and all of the folks that are here to talk about a very important issue. Before I get started, I do want to say, Congressman Marshall, your dad was right. It was okay to move to Georgia. And he was right at the time. And the environment changed. You know, Atlanta just blew up, and it just started sucking the water out of Alabama. Now, we should have saw that coming probably, but I think it's a very good point for us to appreciate for the discussion that we're going to have today, because that happens quite often where small communities start to develop. They haven't created the water infrastructure that they need in order to capture the supply that they need, and then all of a sudden we're in a situation like we see in Georgia and Alabama and Florida, and I'll talk about that. My brother is here, Anthony, if you'll raise your hand. Yeah, he's here as a fellow. I asked him if he wanted to put on my suit and uniform, come up here. Everybody confuses us with each other, but it's good that the military can send fellows to places like this. One of the things our Chief of Staff of the Army is working hard to do is broaden our leaders and to send them out to institutions and agencies across the country and the world, in fact, in order to broaden our leaders who are going to have to engage in the interagency and the joint community. I was in Africa about 2 years ago. I was the G1 of the Army, and they introduced me as the head of personnel. And General Odierno was supposed to go. They had all of the Army chiefs of their armies were there, and my job was talking about raising an Army, because I was the head recruiter before. I was in charge of manning the Army. And they also introduced me that I had been nominated for the chief engineer position. And as I went into the bilats and as I went into the questions and answers, all of the questions were on Corps of Engineer type things, which was fascinating to me because I hadn't spent as much time in the Corps as I had on the warfighting side. In fact, the Angola Chief of Staff said he wanted to create his own Corps of Engineers. How do I do that? And then I was visiting with General Rodriguez, the AFRICOM commander, and he said, give me a 2-page summary of the Corps of Engineers and how it was created. Well, it took us over 200 years, so this is not, I put it in 2 pages, but it was hard. But the point is, I think the Corps offers some things that are at the nexus of what you see here. This is my only slide, so I don't have a whole lot of slides if you were expecting anything, and I'll talk about that near the end. But when you think about the 3Ds, the Corps, like many of the organizations here, is heavily involved in this. Now, the other thing that's interesting about the Corps, Joe Sullivan mentioned fracking and what we're doing there, and why is the Corps involved in that? You know, the Corps is involved in so many things, sometimes it's just frightening to me. I wake up and somebody calls me and asks me, you know, why are we doing this? And a quick story, the Smithsonian called me up and said, hey, we'd like you to come over and have lunch. I said, okay, well, what are we doing with the Smithsonian? What are they mad about? You know? And we have lunch and everything's over, and then the president says, you know, we'd like your T-Rex. Excuse me? We'd like your Tyrannosaurus Rex. You want my Tyrannosaurus Rex? I really don't have one at home or anything. I mean, what do you mean you want my T-Rex? Well, I go back to my office, and sure enough, the Corps of Engineers has one of the most complete Tyrannosaurus Rex in the world. It's about 85% complete. It's in Montana. This is just a commercial because on the 16th of October is Fossil Day, if you didn't know that. It's Fossil Day for the nation, and on the mall, T-Rex, well, it's not going to be on the mall, but they're going to be celebrating the arrival of T-Rex that was found by a young lady up in Montana. It was on Corps property, and therefore it belongs to us. But if there's something good or something to be blamed on, the Corps sometimes has something to do with it. So it's great for me to be here today with you to talk about this important topic. You know, it was Benjamin Franklin who once said, and I quote, when the well's dry, we know the worth of water. When the well's dry, we know the worth of water. Too often, this becomes the case. Whether we're talking about water, electricity, or reliable infrastructure, we often do not realize the value of something until we no longer have it. In my role as the Chief Engineer, I serve as a member of the Army staff and advise the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army on engineering matters related in support of our combatant commanders and our international partners in the interagency. I also direct the modern world's oldest water resources agency, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, 35,000 civilians, and only 600 military, like myself. Due to its combination of civil works and military missions, the Corps of Engineers finds itself at the apex of both national security and water resources management issues. I hope to spend some time this morning reflecting on the intersection of these two topics and looking at the lessons learned by our nation and others that can inform a 21st century dialogue about water resources and security. I'm going to hearken back to what we talked about earlier, the water wars. For many years, world leaders have suggested that water would be a major source of geopolitical conflict in the 21st century, the next oil, so to speak. This is not a theory limited to foreign nations. In fact, water wars is often bandied about in our own media to describe the conflict of water supply and allocation in the southeast United States and other regions. The Georgia, Florida, and Alabama is one of the most famous water wars that is talked about. Fortunately, the Corps and the nation have developed the infrastructure and the systems that we have in place to handle such disputes. We're not shooting at each other like they may be in other countries, but water disputes still remain a source of heated debate in our country and are often only settled in the courts. If we see water as a matter of fighting over allocations of limited or diminishing flows, as many now seem to do, it is easy to come to the conclusion of inevitable water wars. However, the history of water resources management's role in the development of civilizations has a very different side to it. In fact, water plays a powerful role in society. It's responsible for judicious water resources management can lead to peace building as a method for preventive diplomacy and building a culture of cooperation. Water can also bring together adversaries, provide a venue for dialogue, and help integrate in a practical way diverse interests and values. The water security discussions focus on water availability and access. This discussion leads to the thought that water security might cause conflicts or violence, which others may address today. Rather than looking primarily at water scarcity as causing war or how water distribution or flows might create war, we could usefully look at those places we see strategically as important and ask this question: how might investment in water management and water infrastructure help achieve security in an unstable region? And that is part of what I'd like to address with the audience today. I would like to start with a historical perspective of our own country. And perhaps it would be helpful to look at how this theory plays out in the United States and our role in management of water resources infrastructure. You know, I was getting ready for a meeting at the White House, and we're worried about or concerned about the rock pinnacles. And during the drought, the water got so low that these rock pinnacles were sticking out, and we almost stopped barge track. In fact, we had to slow it down considerably. And the goal from the president on down was to blow the rocks out of there so we could get 2 feet of depth and allow the barge traffic to flow again. So, and as General Sullivan said, we go from floods to droughts, and the management of that is in the infrastructure and the development that we have. But there was a question asked of me, how long has the Corps been on the rivers? Because we'd just done Hurricane Sandy, so you know, and there was kind of a sigh of relief. Okay, you're going to be helping us with these rocks, and I said, well, you want me to go back 200 years, or you know, lay it out from there? Because you know, it was in 1809 that President Thomas Jefferson, who was incidentally the president who established the Corps of Engineers as a permanent and separate branch of the United States Army, he commissioned what's called the Gallatin Report. And the report, written by then Secretary of Treasury Thomas Gallatin, outlined how we should use our water resources for economic development, for building our nation, and for national security. Water resources have often been a key means for the United States to achieve other national and regional security and economic goals. Some examples to reflect on: the Reclamation Act in the early 1900s, which funded irrigation projects in 20 arid states as a means to populate areas in the West. Public water utilities were used as a means to halt disease and epidemic outbreaks in cities in the late 18th century. Large multi-purpose infrastructure projects helped spur socio-economic development, such as the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Columbia River system. Large-scale ecological restoration projects in the 21st century, like the Everglades and the Gulf Coast, helped restore and achieve new environmental and economic goals. The Corps of Engineers has been helping this nation manage its water resources ever since 1802 and has been involved in many other efforts that I just mentioned, beyond those that I just mentioned. Since the mid-19th century, the Corps has also played a major role in designing and constructing flood risk management infrastructure, that is, those projects and systems which reduce risk of damage from floods and storm events. These types of projects are vital to assuring social stability in times of stress. They help ensure social systems such as transportation, public health, public safety, sanitation, and energy can continue to function. You need only to look at post-Katrina and what happened in Katrina to understand how those systems can fail if we don't have the structures in place, the infrastructure, in order to control disasters in those times, and then to capture that water in times of later need. Part of the discussion on water security and conflict prevention should also focus on holistic water resources management, including enhanced resilience to water-related disasters. I thought it would be helpful to look at 3 floods that took place in 2010 and 2011 in the United States, China, and Pakistan to illustrate the value of managing risk and ensuring that there is resilience in our water resources infrastructure. First, on the Mississippi. Throughout the first 2 centuries of our nation's existence, there were a series of significant floods along the Mississippi River. But perhaps the greatest flood of record was the 1927 flood. These floods caused loss of between 250 and 500 lives. It flooded more than 16 million acres and left more than 500,000 people homeless in the United States. The passage of the Flood Control Act of 1928 led to the authorization of the Mississippi Rivers and Tributaries System. It rejected the idea that levees alone could contain the river. This plan explicitly included room for the river, structural and non-structural approaches. The Mississippi River Tributaries System has been constructed over the last 85 years. It's currently 89% complete. A lot of you think about the Corps and how long we take to finish projects, and what you may not know is that we've got about $60 billion worth of projects that have been authorized, and each year we have about $1.5 billion in which to put against those authorizations. So we spread it like peanut butter, and it takes a long time, unfortunately, to get these projects. But thank goodness this was at 89% when the floods of 2011 hit. It was the Army Corps of Engineers working with federal, state, and local agencies to utilize the Mississippi rivers and tributary systems in a way that it was designed. During this event, which rivaled the 1927 flood, the MRNT worked as planned. It confined the flood to the natural and overflow areas and protected more than 4 million people, 10 million acres of land, and 1 million structures. It prevented more than $110 billion worth of damage, and there was not a single life lost. The United States investment in this construction in the MRNT paid huge dividends. In fact, the majority of U.S. infrastructure that exists today was built between 1920 and 1980. President Roosevelt was a key leader in developing that infrastructure. Much of it has now reached or exceeded its planned design life. Water resources infrastructure kept pace with population growth until the mid-1980s, probably when your dad was in West, sir, when investments were sufficient enough to keep up with population growth. It is now no longer sufficient. Today, the U.S. spends less than 2% of our GDP on infrastructure, while India invests 5% and China invests 7%. But one of the things that it may have gone unnoticed to many across the country, that one of the key things that happened during the 2011 flood was the opening of one of the levees so that we could flood an area, give room for the river to flood. The person that gave the command to blow that levee is sitting right there. General Walsh, why don't you raise your hand there? But I looked at him on TV and I thought, this guy's like God. I mean, he's making this decision. The president's not involved, but you know, as the head of Mississippi River Division, he made that call, and it was a tough one. But I just wanted to recognize Mike. He's got 37 years in the Army, and he's going to be retiring this year, and he's going to go out with a lot of the institutional knowledge that this organization has. And I want just, if everybody could help me in recognizing his service. So that system started in 1927 and lasted all these years, almost 90% complete, has literally saved lives in this country. But we've got to invest more. Let's look at the Yangtze floods. Flooding along the Yangtze River in China has always been a major problem, and the relatively dense populations and large cities along the river make floods deadly and very costly. The most recent major floods were the 1998 Yangtze River floods, but the most disastrous were the 1954 Yangtze River floods, killing around 30,000 people. Like the Mississippi, the Yangtze River in China experienced a flood of record in June of 2011. However, China had invested in its infrastructure, and the Three Gorges dams was in place. During this event, the Three Gorges Dam prevented billions of dollars of damages to downstream cities. It enabled considerable resilience to the local communities. Indeed, despite the focus on hydropower benefits, flood risk reduction has been the major economic benefit of the Three Gorges Dam. These and other similar events in our countries have brought the U.S., the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and the Chinese Minister of Water close together in a remarkable sense of technical exchanges and visits over the last decade. Finally, I'd like to go to the Indus River. The Indus flood of 2010 had a much different outcome due to the lack of water resources infrastructure in Pakistan. During those floods, the White House coordinator for Afghanistan and Pakistan said, quote, "Every dimension of our relationship, politics, economics, and security, is going to see major shifts as a result of this historic disaster," unquote. 1/5 of the country was covered in floodwater, with more than 21 million people affected, including 10 million left homeless. There was a death toll of approximately 2,000. The total economic impact of this flood was in the billions. Unfortunately, the level of storm and frequency of this event, which was called a 50-year storm, is happening more frequently, and we can certainly expect that it will be repeated again. Post-event studies at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources with the Pakistani experts clearly show that had the infrastructure planned over the last 3 decades been in place, damages would have been dramatically reduced, and more importantly, in a very unstable region, social disruption could have been greatly mitigated. We can clearly see here the intersection of stability and water investment, and in particular, in a particularly strategic part of the world. This is just one example of a region where population and economic activities have continued to grow, while investment in water resources management has not, and the result has been catastrophic. Now, reflecting back to the issue of water scarcity with these 3 floods in mind, one thought should be that investments in water resource management and infrastructure can certainly be a valuable tool in capturing water when it is available and more effectively managing the supply of water when it is not. The end result is the same. Effective water resource management and resilient infrastructure encourages security, encourages capital flows into a region, which creates a platform for growth and development. We saw the benefits of this effort in the early development of our own country. As I finish up here, I want to recognize that investment infrastructure pays off by reducing risk and ensuring social and economic stability. We must continue to look at ways in which water resources management can be a strategic tool in support of the 3 Ds: United States security, defense, diplomacy, and development. Much of what we have said this morning really echoes to the words of one of our greatest soldier statesmen, General George C. Marshall, regarding the Marshall Plan. In 1947, he said, and I quote, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so that to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist," end quote. If I may paraphrase him, I would add, water resources management, its purpose should be to aid in the development of a working economy around the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I look forward to participating and learning from each of you as the day goes on. The Army Corps of Engineers is a proud organization. We're proud to serve you. We're proud to serve this nation and work in the international community. Thank you.
Closing. We got it, yes. That will be good. Good morning, I'm Dr. John Kelly from the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, and I want to thank General Bostick for those inspiring words and setting the tone for this next panel. What we're going to be doing is outlining some of the challenges, some of the security objectives that we are going to face with the project that we're engaged in. It is very important to recognize that this partnership between the United States Institute for Peace, the AUSA, the great work of Hattie Babbitt, and the U.S. Water Partnership have all brought us here today as kind of a first step. And what this panel will be doing is looking at the trends and the challenges and the opportunities that are out there in regard to the water security nexus. It is important to recognize that the panelists that we have here today are going to lay the groundwork for you in terms of what will follow in the afternoon panel and the luncheon presentation from General Talley. And that what we'll be doing is restricting each of the, not restricting, but offering each of the panelists about a 5-minute opportunity to make some opening remarks. And then what we'll do is when the panelist is finished, we have microphones set up on either side, and we'll ask that you line up to do the questions. I'll take them in a set of 3 for the individuals who are on the panel, and then we'll conclude with Lieutenant General Talley doing a presentation and showing us a short video. So this is the order of business. I'd like to begin with Aaron Salzberg. Aaron, you just returned from Stockholm, and I want to get into it because I know the questions are going to be great. You just returned from Stockholm, and I think there was some significant events that took place there. And I'm just wondering, are we seeing the evolution of an ethic or the political will that's necessary worldwide to deal with water challenges?
Stockholm this year, in fact, it's a wonderful event for those of you who haven't been there. It really is where the world does its work on water. It's a great mixture of both practitioners, policymakers, governments, non-governmental organizations. Really an amazing event over the course of a week. And this year's theme was on water cooperation. And so it was an issue that we paid a lot of attention to. We spent a lot of time working with the organizers on about how you frame discussions. I think the one thing I would point to is that every year in Stockholm for the last 10 or 12 years, we've been having a meeting of donors, a quiet meeting on the side, where we talk about transboundary water challenges, where we're working, how we're working, what are some of the key issues we're facing, what is this nexus between development and diplomacy. And it's a process that we started here in the United States and transitioned over to Stockholm in about 2000. And I think one of the key differences that we've noted, not only is that that room is now filled up, and what started with just a small core group of partners has really grown, and we're having troubles finding bigger and bigger space. And the other is the change in the people who are coming. And I think this year was particularly notable in that the foreign affairs people outnumber the development people. And so you're seeing a real shift in who's paying attention to these issues and why they're paying attention to these issues. So I think we are. I think we are seeing water and security really growing on the political agenda, both internationally as well as certainly here for us in the United States.
Now the opportunity to make your 5-minute statement, if you would.
Oh, well, thanks, appreciate it. You know, and I don't think I'll talk about the numbers about water. I think a lot of you get this, and I'm looking around the room and I see a lot of familiar faces, so I think you know some of this. But maybe just 5 points that'll help spark some of the conversation with the panelists. The first, and I think General Bostick made this very well, which is don't get caught up in the water wars rhetoric. It may be tempting, and it may be headline grabbing, and it may sell books, but water wars are extremely rare. More often than not, as General Bostick pointed out, water is a source of cooperation and not conflict. This doesn't mean we don't have a problem. There are over 260 basins that are shared by 2 or more countries, and as supplies decline and demand grows, disagreements over who gets to use what water for what purpose where is likely to rise among countries and within countries. And I'm sure, as Rich will point out, you know, these are issues that are going to have impacts on countries that we care quite a bit about, including on peace and security and stability. So our goal, and our goal of the State Department, is to keep these disagreements from escalating into violent conflict, and to use water as a means for strengthening trust and cooperation. And this latter point is important. Again, General Bostick, I think, made this very well. Most everyone cares about the water that they drink, and they care about the water that they need for food and for other purposes. Increased transparency and accountability between service providers advances democratic values. Strong regional institutions can help bring countries together and minimize the likelihood of conflict generally. And so we shouldn't lose the value of water as a peace-building tool. Again, a point that was made very well. I think the second point is look beyond the river. While there's very often legitimate competing interests, dispute over shared waters, particularly between countries, are often viewed through a national security lens and are embedded within a much broader set of economic, social, and geopolitical issues. In some cases, water, rivers, lakes, the ecosystems are closely tied to a sense of national identity, and the development of these resources is seen as a sovereign right. And this is important to keep in mind really for 2 reasons. First, what might look like a dispute over water might not really be a dispute over water at all. And second, the solution to a water dispute might not involve water at all. The third point is that the journey can be more important than the destination. These are not easy problems to solve. Again, many times, very legitimate competing interests between upstream and downstream parties embedded within a very complex economic, social, political environment. Data is often very poor, and myths are often more common than facts. So getting an answer is particularly hard in these situations. And even if we did, you know, odds are that answer we got today won't be good tomorrow. And so, drawing back on something that Churchill said, you know, plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. It's really the process that matters here. And so our goal is really to support countries in building a process that enables the countries themselves to use science and technology to better understand the challenges that they face, and to jointly make sound decisions, sound development decisions on how these shared resources get managed. Institutionalizing these processes within a formal regional mechanism or institutions like a River Basin Commission, that's the best outcome. That's the holy grail. It's what we're really after. These institutions, they can serve as regional platforms for adaptively managing shared water resources that are critically important, not just today, but into the future in a peaceful and cooperative way. And there are good examples of this throughout the world. General Bostick mentioned Pakistan. You know, here the Indus River Commission. You know, this is a commission that stood and has functioned for years throughout conflict and hostilities between the countries. Institutions can be critically important and a strong binding tool between countries. Last, since you all seem interested and want to get involved, be prepared. Rocket science is easier. I can say that I'm an ex-rocket scientist. Responding to these challenges requires patience, flexibility, closely coordinated development and diplomatic support. Institutionalizing these mechanisms for development cooperation can take years, if not decades. Initial steps are often focused on just building an atmosphere of trust and cooperation. while developing a common understanding of some of the challenges and opportunities that might exist for coordinated development and management. Building political will, getting the parties to the table is one of the hardest things that we can do. And how you convince countries to what might appear to them be as ceding their sovereignty, to come to the table and to talk about some of these issues, very, very challenging. And we have to be very opportunistic. Oftentimes, the advances are tied to personalities. You have the right minister, the right head of state, the right elections at the right time. These can open up doors or close doors. And so being able to take advantage of these opportunities when they come up is really, really important. And so as donors, we have to maintain flexibility to respond when these opportunities arise. And most importantly, we have to be very careful and cautious and respect that the countries involved and allow them to lead the process in a supporting role. The fact is, they know these problems better than we do. And they really need to take the lead, and we need to find ways of supporting their efforts in these processes. I can see just to highlight a couple of things, we've been taking this problem very seriously. In light of those points, we, the Department of State, launched what is called the Shared Waters Partnership up at UNDP. And this is a multi-donor platform to support dialogue in countries and in regions where we think there's the likelihood of conflict over water resources. And this is becoming a very important program for us as we begin to operationalize some of our thoughts on water throughout the world. We don't do this work alone. The department chairs an interagency process which includes representatives from some 20-odd U.S. government agencies and departments. That's our brain trust. People like the folks from the Corps, EPA, NASA, I've seen some others in the room. These are the folks that we rely on to help guide our thinking as we move forward on issues like this. Hopefully some of these points will get the conversation started. Secretary Kerry has often noted that building capacity on water is one of the most important things that we can do to save lives. So I appreciate the fact that all of you are taking the time to join us today and that we get a chance to hear from you about this important issue.
Thank you, Aaron. Again, being so anxious to get this thing rolling, I forgot to introduce the fact that he's the Special Coordinator for Water Resources in the Office of Environmental Sustainability within the U.S. Department of State, and is the guru of water for those of us who have been following this particular issue. So thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce Major General Richard Engel, who's the Director of Environment and Natural Resources at the National Intelligence Council. And they published a very provocative report in 2012. And this report had pointed out the criticality of water as an issue in terms of conflicts around the world and the requirement on the part of the U.S. intelligence community to pay attention to it. General Engel.
Thank you. What I'd like to do is just give you briefly a synopsis of that report in 5 minutes to kind of give you the key takeaways that we have from it. We actually started that report at the request of the Department of State. It was probably the first time the National Intelligence Council had done a major estimate looking at water issues globally, and it was an educational experience for us. I know a little water fast, so I won't give you water facts. There's some really fascinating ones we learned along the way. But let me go through the 5 key judgments. The first one was the observation that during the next 10 years, water problems. And we define this generally as polluted water, inadequate water, or floods. In other words, water not in the right quantity and in the condition you needed to use it, would contribute to instability in states important to the United States. We didn't see water issues by themselves resulting in state failure, but what we saw would happen would be that water issues would combine with other problems going on inside a country, poverty, social tensions, poor governance, income inequality, and so forth. And that could at least trip social disruptions, riot, protest, and social disruptions could ultimately lead to political disruptions and potentially state disruptions and state failure. We also observed that some states are better prepared to handle these kind of challenges than others. May come as no surprise, states that are financially capable or have great technical ability as it relates to water would be in a better position than other states. Our second judgment really had to do with state-on-state conflict, and you've heard that mentioned twice before, and I'll just go through what we saw real quickly. We did not see state-on-state conflict as likely in the next 10 years. And as Aaron observed, historically, water has been an issue that has actually forced states to sit down and work issues in a common way, which we thought was great. However, intelligence community was becoming a little bit more dire. We saw water could be used as leverage. What you'd initially see was one state would stop another state from doing investments to protect its interests. It would try and work through NGOs, back channel to degrade certain projects from happening that they thought would disadvantage them. And finally, they would encourage other states to withhold funding. So we had this tension between states over water development. We recognized there was an increased risk that terrorists and other nefarious actors would use water as weapons. They would either withhold it from citizens or seek to damage valuable infrastructure. And finally, beyond 10 years, for those reasons, we thought water-related conflict was plausible. Now, I will say, and this gets to a point that Aaron also made, that we didn't see water as itself probably being the principal cause. There would be other sources of friction between these states, and water would just be the excuse for it to be used. Our third key judgment really had to do, this was tremendous, an epiphany for me, because I had no idea this was taking place around the world. But our third key judgment related to depletion of groundwater for agriculture. We found that groundwater was being depleted around the world in excess of its replenishment rates, and it posed risks to both national and global food markets as a result. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa have all overpumped their groundwater. In some developing countries, 95% of the water they use is for agriculture, so you can appreciate that this groundwater is gone. Their agricultural capacity is significantly degraded. What would happen when that occurred is states would increasingly have to go to global food markets for food, and as a result of that, where their food may have been reasonably priced, it would now be considerably more expensive. Our fourth key judgment had to do with economic capacity. We saw that degraded water availability would negatively impact the economic growth and capacity of some important trading partners for the United States. This degrades their ability to manufacture electricity and indeed run their general manufacturing operations. Hydropower is very important in many parts of the world. 15 developing countries generate 80% or more of their electrical power from hydropower. So the absence of reliable water for hydropower generation would be significant to them. Hydropower is also, and people may not appreciate this, is a significant consumer of water. A typical 100 megawatt dam, the dam behind it, evaporates 15.8 million gallons of water per day that is not available for downstream users. Our last key judgment, after going through all the bad news, kind of opened up some opportunities. Maybe this will provide some opportunities for people to think about what you want to talk about later on. We saw that from now through 2040, improved water management were the best solutions for water problems. Pricing allocation would be critical. Water is not adequately or correctly or evenly priced globally. Agriculture, for example, may pay as little as 10 cents per cubic meter. Household may pay $1 to $3 per cubic meter for water. So there's quite a bit of difference in subsidy if you think of it for agriculture. In some parts of the world, water is considered a free commodity, so there's no motivation for the farmer to use water in an efficient way. Finally, we saw that virtual water trade of goods and services that have water embedded in them, particularly food and other products, would be a good way for countries that don't have natural water to take advantage of it by selling other goods and services. Of course, that only works if they have something they can go to the global markets with to generate revenue for their procurement. As has been observed, we drew the conclusion that investments in water-related infrastructure was critical, agriculture, power, and manufacturing to make sure water was used efficiently. And finally, to get off the stage, I guess our bottom line in terms of improving the way water was used, the biggest low-hanging fruit was in agriculture. Because globally, and as I said, it does very globally, close to 70% of the water consumed is consumed for agriculture. Improving the way we use water for agriculture is the best to achieving our capacity for efficient water use globally. The United States, interestingly enough, has a lot to offer because we are experts in hydrological skills. We have good skill sets in that area. We have the capacity to go around the world and provide that, and it should be well received. Often we think there will be pressure on the United States for us actually to assist with water projects. And water is one of those things that you make the investment in early, and you have to maintain the infrastructure so it doesn't degrade. And if you do make that investment early, you do work the management early, you can certainly avoid what we saw with the high-risk conflicts that would degrade U.S. national security in the long term.
Thank you, General Engel. You just remind me of the fact that everyone knows that Chicken Little was operating under a false hypothesis, but that the boy who cried wolf was just ahead of his time. So it's the next speaker is an individual who I think will contribute greatly to this discussion. It's Manish Rapnath, the Executive Vice President of the World Resources Institute.
I'm delighted.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Manish.
I actually have some slides, so should I?
Is Amanda,
Is there?
do we have someone who has the,
Fantastic. Should I just clicker? Just is there a clicker or? This is right here. Okay. So delighted. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. My name is Manish Rapnath, World Resources Institute, a research institute based here in Washington, D.C., focused on a wide range of sustainability and economic development challenges. And I wanted to pick up on Aaron's point about myths are more common than facts, and actually talk a little bit about water risk. That's what I want to briefly mention today. What is water risk? How do we measure and map water risk? And how can this help improve decision-making and mitigate the risks that we've been talking about today? And these questions about 2-3 years ago led to a pretty creative partnership where we've come together with Goldman Sachs, GE, Coca-Cola, a wide range of companies and foundations to create a global water risk mapping initiative, something that we call Aqueduct. This is just one example of where Aqueduct was used. It was actually in the National Intelligence Council's estimate on water security, and that appeared in the map that the previous speaker just mentioned. And by identifying kind of where and how scarcity and other water risks are emerging around the world, we feel that this tool can do a tremendous job in helping identify and help us respond to potential water conflict. This is incredibly immodest, but I think we believe that Aqueduct is actually the most high resolution, the most comprehensive, the most up-to-date water risk mapping tool and data source in the world. And it's a lot more than just maps. It's an interactive online tool. And what we do is we spend a lot of time collecting and aggregating all the global data sets on water that we've been able to find around the world. Satellite data from NASA, data sets that have been collected by a wide range of research institutes, universities around the world. But then we also developed some models to kind of downscale, oftentimes country-level statistics to the watershed or sub-watershed levels to try to get much, much more granular data. We also, when people talk about water risk, what does water risk actually mean? And so we unpacked water risk into about 12 different indicators such as baseline water stress, interannual variability, drought severity, groundwater stress. You can see them in the top right corner. And we've actually grouped these indicators under 3 categories of risks. Risks related to scarcity or quantity of water, risks related to the quality of water, and risks related to regulation or reputational issues. And what you see, this map kind of in the background, is kind of the integrated 12 indicators for the entire world. But you can actually take a particular region, the Middle East and North Africa, and actually show what each of these indicators actually looks like, with obviously red being an area of greater risk. And what we're trying to do is trying to kind of unpack water along these 12 indicators and offer the data that underpins each of these indicators to make that available online in a very disaggregated manner as transparently as possible. Here is what, if you took those 12 indicators, took the weighted average, what it would look like for the Middle East and North Africa region. And you can clearly see that some of the areas with the greatest water risk are also areas where we see significant existing or potential conflict. One of the things that also makes this tool, I think, quite distinct is this highly granular information. Around the world, we've actually tried to collect data at the catchment level. Kind of these little pieces that you see, these parcels in the Middle East and North Africa. It's about 15,000 around the world, about 1,400 in Middle East and North Africa. So you get a sense a little bit about the resolution that this tool is able to provide. And we also try to collect as much time series data as possible. So the runoff data here that we have used 58 years every month. What's also quite powerful is once you have this data, you can overlay other resources, other challenges on top of it. So what this map is of proposed coal plants to be built in China. And the dots are where the coal power plants are intended to be sited. And what you see here is that over 50% of the future coal plants that will be built in China are either in areas of high or extremely high baseline water stress. Right? So the risks of energy supply disruptions, potential conflict about users become quite readily apparent. I was in Beijing last month at a energy conference, and I showed this particular map. And it was striking just how palpable kind of the attention in China on the issues of when you begin to interlake these issues of water availability and energy. And so this ability to actually add layers to the maps, layers around primary energy, whether it's coal, whether it's shale gas, whether it's biofuels, or even individual crops, wheat, corn, or so forth, will create some very interesting maps that begin to display visually some of the tension between water, energy, and food that we're beginning to see today. Just want to close by saying, moving forward, we're going to be investing quite a bit more in trying to make these maps even more comprehensive, even having the most up-to-date data, get a little bit deeper around getting groundwater issues for the reasons that were mentioned by some of the earlier speakers, getting water quality information more actively into the maps, looking at the latest global circulation models to get the latest projections of water stress from the impacts of climate change, and also dealing with floods, which we recognize as a huge issue. Just want to close by saying, I think I've been working on water for over 20 years. I think they're quintessentially, water challenges are quintessentially political economy, governance issues, that improving transparency, addressing accountability are critical to overcoming these governance challenges. And we hope that this tool, this ability to kind of collect and make this level of data transparent, accessible to all, will just be one small, modest step in helping address these governance failures. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manish. You're next. Next, we have Ms. Laura Hennish, who's Vice President of CH2M Hill, which is a water business group. I believe you also have some slides.
I do have some slides. It's Harnish, for the record.
Okay.
Let's see. Do we have my first slide? Thank you. So before I get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about CH2M Hill, because who we are and our values inform very much how we view our role and the role of the private sector in solving this incredibly complex and urgent problem. So is it, which button? This one maybe. There we go. CH2M Hill is an employee-owned global project delivery company. Our explicit mission is to help clients build a better and more sustainable world. We work in 122 countries across the globe. We provide services for water, energy, ecosystems, transportation, and mining around the world. And we clearly see, as the other speakers have described, how all these sectors are deeply interconnected, and we know they can't be addressed in silos. Working safely, ethically, and sustainably are paramount to us, which of course all of those things come into play when thinking about working in some of these conflict areas. The private sector has many roles to play in water security. Perhaps the most obvious role the private sector plays is to identify and apply state-of-the-art science and technology to water security challenges. However, as we've worked around the world, we've increasingly recognized that that isn't enough. What's needed for durable water solutions is a much broader tool set that includes providing decision makers with planning tools that bring stakeholders together, as others have talked about, so they can transparently and accurately explore alternative solutions. In these processes, the private sector can play the invaluable role of providing independent advice, bringing credible data and science to the table. We're actively designing these kinds of processes and facilitating them to successful conclusions around the world. The World Economic Forum project on innovative water partnerships explored and highlighted some of these types of approaches. The private sector also brings an overall systems perspective that drives the integration of the water, energy, food, and ecological resources nexus and helps to deliver sustainable water planning and infrastructure projects. We're developing and using tools that acknowledge these interrelationships between sectors and that aim to optimize resource efficiency and resolve conflicts between those sectors. Of course, water security is the crucial level in managing these integrated resource systems under threats such as climate change, population changes, and landscape scale changes. The private sector also actively and productively engages in philanthropic and volunteer efforts. One of the groups we support globally is Water for People. This organization brings together local entrepreneurs, civil society, governments, and communities to establish collaborative solutions that allow people to build and maintain their own reliable and safe water systems, which is a huge need all around the world, as I'm sure everyone here knows. Throughout our many decades of work in the water sector, we've learned that major water resources and water security projects can succeed only if the proper conditions are in place. There must be a pathway for decision-making, safe conditions for our team and our partners, an ethical business environment, appropriate financing, and the right partners. In addition to having strong partnerships with organizations like World Bank and USAID, the U.S. Water Partnership, and the World Economic Forum, we also know that it's critical to have partners on the ground at the local level. We understand the critical role that the grassroots and non-governmental organizations play, and that women in particular play throughout the developing world in water issues. They are the ones that carry the water quite literally. All that said, the private sector can and does provide support tools and services to manage the entire water cycle: surface water, groundwater, desalination, stormwater, flood management, wastewater, etc. A couple of examples of projects. While these examples are distinct from the Indus and Niger basins, in some ways they certainly have significant corollaries in that growing population, climate change, scarcity, and of course conflict to varying degrees are significant drivers that are bringing stakeholders to the table. Starting here in the US, we recently completed the 7-state Colorado River Basin Supply and Demand Study. Not unexpectedly, we found that demand already far exceeds supply and is projected to only get worse as populations increase and predicted climate change reduces supplies along the Colorado River. The next phase of this project is looking at climate adaptation and mitigation strategies to meet water needs over the next 50 years. The study addresses all water users, agricultural, municipal, industrial, energy, and ecosystems, and we're now developing tools that will evaluate and optimize the integration across these sectors. This is a program that has extensive stakeholder participation. And water delivery obligations to Mexico are a critical part of crafting solutions in this program. Across the globe, the Mekong River Commission has been using the HALCRO developed decision support framework to support the delivery of integrated water resource management for the Mekong River Basin in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, Thailand, and Vietnam. The key underpinning of our work for the Mekong River Commission is building shared databases and developing shared hydrologic water resource models, which all riparian countries can access, thus promoting transparency and regional cooperation. The second key part of the project here, and something important for other geographies, has been capacity building to assure ongoing local capabilities are in place. So the role of the private sector goes beyond simply doing the work, but then also transferring the knowledge locally so that that work, in this case modeling and decision-making, can advance integrated water resources management planning in country. This work is not without its challenges, to be sure, but some successes have been realized. These projects and many more illustrate the power of public-private partnerships in identifying and addressing water security issues. We appreciate the opportunity to contribute insight from our experience delivering projects and applaud the decision makers that are mobilizing to take the long view that includes future socioeconomic, demographic, and climate change, as these factors so strongly influence sustainable and equitable water allocation and agricultural land use and energy planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. The Skoll Global Threats Foundation has determined that if we continue in our present course of action by 2030, that the amount of water usage will double. By 2050, it will be at almost 60%. Food scarcity will increase by 65%. These are kind of alarming forecasts in terms of what lies ahead. Our final panelist, and I'm trying to keep quickly within the timelines here, is Jerry Deli Priscelli, who is the Senior Advisor to the U.S. Corps of Engineers, Governor of the World Water Council, and Editor of Water Policy. Jerry.
Thank you very much. For the technical people, no slides. Keep them off. Everybody has had plenty of pictures, and we brought a lot of things to support it. But I want to thank you, Dr. Kelly, and USIP, and the Army Associations, and particularly our sponsors. As a person who spent 40 years in this business as a political scientist, then an economist, and working all my life with the water engineers worldwide, this is a great gathering. In fact, I wasn't sure I'd ever see such a gathering about 30 years ago or 40 years ago. I have 4 comments, and in the 5 minutes that I'm going to try to address some of the questions. The first is on scarcity and the transboundary waters. As you've heard, really, the water crises, or crises plural, is mainly one of distribution of capacity, knowledges, not really absolute scarcity. There may be some cases that we see of absolute scarcity. But we saw what may happen if we drive our whole debate by the notion of this being absolute scarcity. It's rare. Most people live in places in this planet where the water comes in only a short period of time. Fundamental issue if we're going to think about how we're going to deal with this. But we also have to know that as people change, as people become richer, our countries become richer, they use the water differently. And they don't use it in the same per capita volumes. So water is constantly changing, and its uses are changing. So there's a dynamic that's going on that's very important. This observation should be critically important to this kind of audience, because it's in the transitions and the redistribution of water where we see the violence emerging, and we see the keys to what may be violent behavior emerging, namely relative deprivation as opposed to the absolute deprivation. The world's actually figured this out. You heard a little bit about virtual trading. There's a lot more of that going on than we think, and it's kind of a large adaptation to this problem. Now, there are river basins that may be at risk, because we know 40% of the planet and the population live around these basins. The likelihood of conflict can rise if the rates of change within the basins are exceeding the capacities of our institutions, to deal with these issues. In fact, we heard mentioned the river basin organizations. This is a concept that we talk about as if it's new, but Teddy Roosevelt talked about it in the turn of the century. The United Nations in the 1950s talked about this. In fact, the Romans created mediating institutions on the Danube and the Rhine to deal with between the barbarians, what they call the barbarians in Rome. Why? To keep navigation flowing on the rivers. This is not, this water and its use in mediation and transboundary is not new in our world. We have some shared ideas about how to deal with this in the UN conventions, where we talk about looking at equitable use and reasonable harm, prevention of significant harm, prior notification. These are accepted principles. The only problem with them is that we don't know how to prioritize among them. So upstream countries will claim one, downstream countries will claim another. And when they eventually do go to international courts, what happens is the courts say, you've both done wrong, go back and mediate. That's happened over and over again. So this is the business of a place like this, very much so. And we need tremendous innovations here. It's a very important message, I think. My second area of comment on Africa, development, growth, and the transboundary issues in Africa. There's significant correlations between rainfall and its variability and the gross domestic products in various countries. Wealthy nations like us and others in the West share a small window, which is a favorable climate, meaning low variability and moderate rainfall. Most of the sub-Saharan countries face more challenging climates, high variability, high median rainfall. In fact, the IMI, the International Institute of Water Management in Sri Lanka, notes that Ethiopia, its limited ability to cope with droughts and floods are estimated now to cost their economy 1/3 of its growth potential. Imagine that. What would aid do if you're losing 1/3 of your potential because you cannot deal and manage the uncertainty? That really calls into question how we're spending the money. And this situation is repeated to the continent. For example, in the Millennium Village projects, which were 5 projects that were put in place to try to deal with Millennium Development Goals, they did a lot of wonderful things, but then what happened? You had droughts, and the whole thing's collapsed. You weren't managing the resource. Experts note that 50% of the population in Africa is highly dependent, and almost 2/3 of it, on shared waters. In southern Africa, 93% of water is in shared basins. 61% of the area, and this is 77% of the people. This means that in the southern African region, regional security complex and water are very, very closely tied. But the great significance of water and security, it's really interesting when you look at both of these in Africa, because those countries that are deemed to be adaptively secure, meaning the ability to deal with the kinds of changes that are coming through, aren't necessarily the ones that are heavily endowed with water. They are, in many cases, the ones that have very little water but have invested in infrastructure at the same time, thereby allowing them to adapt and achieve more national security. My third comment has South Asia in the Indus. Now, we've had a lot of statistics and data. We've heard about the floods and that they're 50-year versus 100-year. It may or may not symbolize major changes in climate. There's a relationship that's critically important between a lot of people and activity growing and no concentration on investment in the means to adapt. But through all of this, we may be missing, for an audience like this, the most important message from that area. This is that the Indus River, and Aaron mentioned this, the Indus River Treaty grew in the 1950s as a means to achieve broader security in South Asia as the British Raj was at its decreasing, or they're moving out of the area. What do I mean? What happened was that in order to get that agreement, the President of the United States, talking to the head of the TVA at the time, talked to the President of the World Bank and said, what we need to do in the Indus Valley is create a Tennessee Valley Authority. So an ex-chief of engineers headed the mission in the 1950s. They didn't get a valley authority, but they got a treaty that defined the allocations of water and defined the water rights, which has stood through all sorts of conflict. And interestingly enough, they put a disputes clause into that treaty, which was rare in these treaties at that time, which has just recently been tested. But the testing also shows that maybe looking at just the arbitration model in that clause needs to be broadened. So there's a lot of messages here on this, in the Indus, beyond the numbers, but in terms of how high diplomacy, high technical expertise, and high levels of commitment can combine and are necessary to then achieve major world strategic impacts. My fourth and last notion here is that there is now a relationship we're seeing more and more between good governance and water investments. The political economy of water investments suggests this relationship, and it's very counter to those of you who like the academic world to the old Wittfogel thesis. It's exactly opposite. In fact, we could have a lot of discussions about that. But since these good governance institutions are so important, this water, especially in transboundary areas, this water investments themselves become important. For example, our recent empirical research in the Asian Development Bank points to national water security, which is measured in a lot of dimensions, correlates very highly with the World Bank's indices of governance. Water investment and water governance, good governance, go together. Secondly, our own studies and the core have shown that the Human Development Index, which we all tend to use, it's a composite index from the UN, and dealing with the variability issues, does the same thing. Even USAID data now shows that states that are highly fragile or at high risk for instability are also vulnerable to climate and variability related threats. But the converse isn't true. The ones that have invested and have some wealth in them. So there is this very important relationship between governance and what we would call good governance, generally say a political culture of democracy, and water investments. So there's been a lot of takeaway messages. I'll add just two. in the finishing here. First, I want to urge, like a few others have, don't fall into the Malthusian trap of looking at water or the trend extrapolation trap. What do I mean? It's like population or other trends are growing, increasing, there's a limited pie of water, that's decreasing, and therefore this is the story. Not at all. And actually, inadvertently, if we perpetrate that story, we could create the conflicts we're trying to avoid. The final message that I leave you with is that achieving security in water or water insecurity, it requires more than humanitarian aid. That's important. The aid, the well drilling, the providing of the service, delivery mechanisms. It requires the management of the resources at the resource level, the management of the uncertainties at this level. Because what that does, it breaks the psychological fatalisms that we find over generations in very poor parts of the world, and it reduces the damages and it creates these opportunities for growth. And this is what's really crucial to assuring stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. I think what we've attempted to do with the speakers is to lay out the landscape and the opportunities I think are apparent from what everyone's been talking about, but the challenges are yet to be approached and to be conquered. So at this time what we'd like to do is open it up to the audience and those of you who've been willing to come today and to participate in this. And I'll ask Amanda, the microphones are up. Is that?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you do wish to ask a question of the panel, please raise your hand. The moderator will call on you. We have mic runners that will bring the microphone to you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Okay, a little change in order here. Good. Okay, first, young lady on the left. What I'm going to do is take these in groups of three, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond. On the, ladies and gentlemen, this is your chance. This is your opportunity. Yes, sir.
Then I'll start. Take notes. Is that working? Okay. Gene Brantley with RTI International. Excellent panel this morning and provocative conversations and presentations to all. Thank you. I was also in Stockholm at the World Water Week meetings last week. And it seems that the discussions at that meeting for several years running is very much dominated by the Europeans, the Netherlands Water Partnership, UN organizations, and the presence of U.S. representatives there is not as strong as we would like to see it. Perhaps one of the purposes of this panel this morning and presentation is to generate more commitment and more presence for U.S. influences in this discussion. But I'd like to know, and I know that's one of the reasons why the U.S. Water Partnership was formed. I'd like to know if members of the panel see that same dynamic and what we might do to generate more U.S. engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in the last row.
You have somebody in the front here, too.
Lawrence Freeman, I'm the director of the Africa desk at ER Magazine. I was very glad to hear, especially the last speaker, reject the Malthusian notion of limited resources, too many people. But I think the water question really is not a scarcity question, it's a question of human intervention through infrastructure. I mean, the biosphere is constantly changing and developing. 20,000 years ago, there was plenty of water in North Africa. Human creativity of the mind also is part of the development of the universe. The Russian scientist Vernadsky called it the noosphere. If we build infrastructure, we can move water. Many of the older members in this room will remember that John Kennedy supported a program called NWAPA, North American Water and Power Lines, to bring water flowing in the Pacific Ocean down to the stressed areas of Southern California. I've been working in Africa. There's a program called Transaqua to take water from the Congo Basin across Central African Republic to River Chari to rebuild Lake Chad. So these potentials exist. And I was in Mali last month, and I saw the inland Niger Delta, the largest body of water in the Sahel, which is completely underdeveloped but could feed the Sahel, 2.5 million metric tons of rice. So the question is, can't we mobilize ourselves to a future program where we're actually moving water willfully by human intervention through infrastructure development, which is the most important aspect, so we don't have water scarcity? I think that's the direction we have to go. Thank you.
Thank you. There's this individual here, Prince, and then you.
Hello, I'm Ermias Salas. My question is, there was recently a big controversy between Egypt and the Saharan Africa concerning the use of the Nile water. What do you do with states that have, as a policy, that water is part of their national security, and will adhere to a war if necessary, or subvert it? So what has the international community or the United States proposed to do in these instances? And what do nations do if they take action unilaterally? How does the international community try to prevent these type of conflicts?
Thank you very much. Okay, we have our first three questions. The first question in terms of political will and the mobilization of the United States, I will ask Mr. Salzberg to
Answer all three. Thank you. I'll take the easy one first. Any guesses? Stockholm. You know, I think one of the take-home messages, we had probably the strongest U.S. representation this year than we've ever seen at a Stockholm event. And I think we've seen a trend over the past 10 years where we're getting stronger and stronger U.S. engagement and involvement. And a good measure of that was the opening session, where in the plenary, you know, it featured two U.S. initiatives were mentioned, and one actually was launched there, the Water Grand Challenge from USAID, that had never happened before in a Stockholm event. So I think we really are beginning to embrace it as a place where we, the U.S. government, can not only do a lot of the work that we want to get done, but also highlight some of the accomplishments that we've had. I will pass along an interesting comment that I heard from some of my European colleagues, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why we're all here and we're spending more attention looking at some of these transboundary issues in particular is because of the NIC study. And so they were very supportive of U.S. leadership and what we've done to build awareness of some of these issues and challenges, bringing that into the international community. Because a lot of governments do that kind of work and don't share it publicly. The fact that we were able to do this in an unclassified nature was very useful in our being able to build some of our political will internationally. And I think it has changed a lot of what we're seeing now. So I think it's good. That's a good news story. Your questions with regard to the Nile, a very challenging issue. I mean, here you've got some very legitimate concerns, both upstream and downstream. But there's a process. And we're actually very hopeful that that process will continue to work and that the countries themselves will find a way forward, both as they look generally throughout the basin through the Nile Basin Initiative, but also at a smaller level between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan through the tripartite technical process. Whenever you build large-scale infrastructure on a shared river, it creates challenges downstream. Yeah. And particularly today where, you know, traditionally when countries looked to build this kind of infrastructure, they went to the World Bank or to other large-scale financial institutions where there were very long planning processes and a series of social and environmental safeguards that would help protect some of the countries and the people who live in those areas. Now we're seeing a lot of pressure as we're seeing different types of development take place in basins throughout the world, where large-scale infrastructure can be built without some of these same social and environmental safeguards. That creates some real pressure on regions. And so what we do as the United States is we support a lot of dialogue between these countries. We try to provide technical support if that's helpful, legal support, facilitation support, to bring the countries together quietly. I mean, this really is about the countries themselves. The countries have to lead these processes. We can't come in and tell them this is how you're going to have to solve this problem. That just doesn't work. By and large, the countries will invite us in, we'll spend some time with them, provide them some support, process support. On the Nile in particular, we've been supporting the regional discourse process for 10 years to help bring the countries together around a cooperative framework for development within the basin that respected all the rights that existed within the basin. Very challenging work, and I don't have an easy answer to your questions. But again, I'm hopeful, given some of the fact that the countries are turning towards a process to working together versus some of the rhetoric that we've seen is a very positive step.
Aaron, is anyone else doing what we're doing in the United States in terms of this kind of global partnership of moving our private sector resources and our governmental resources? And what I really see is becoming kind of a tidal wave of support, not to use a poor metaphor, but of support for these kinds of projects. I don't see anyone else doing it. I know the Chinese have an interest in the Mekong, but
Right.
is there anyone else who's doing this? Is the European Union leadership putting forward the billions of dollars that I think the U.S. is talking about committing to these things?
Well, I think there's a difference in magnitude. If you're talking about development issues, I think you're talking about millions and millions of dollars. For some of these processes, and to help with very small amounts of money. I mean, it really doesn't take much money to bring the countries together and to help put together a process that will enable them to think through jointly how they might solve some of these shared water challenges. That said, I mean, there's work by I'm looking around the room and I see so many of our partners, even at a very local level with communities where they're bringing small communities together to talk about how they can solve a particular problem on a local watershed, builds a spirit of cooperation that can help build within a country. Different agencies like NASA, who's doing work to use remote sensing technologies to better understand the water challenges that exist within a country and within regions, critically important in dispelling some of the myths that might exist. Our folks from the Corps who have great relationships with many of these countries and exchanging technical expertise and building the capacity of some of these countries to better understand not only how they manage their drinking water and sanitation problems, let's say locally, but better understand how they have, what their role is with their neighbors, and how they manage some of these shared water challenges with their neighbors, and how they develop infrastructure for multiple purposes across multiple countries. I think there's a lot of capacity, and we're seeing it at all levels from a lot of folks within the room.
Jerry, you want to?
Well, sure. On the question of other countries, there are several partnerships in countries around the world, and they look more like they're country Inc., like Netherlands Inc. or something. And so there are some type relationships there. One of the important aspects of investment in the multipurpose water is that you move yourself out of direct aid. As we know, as direct aid goes up, Africa's getting poorer. But where you have direct investments and vendable, revenue-producing kinds of activities, you get capital markets. The formation of these capital markets builds stability. Well, that's what you do with hydropower and bonding and the rest. So there's a lot going on. I would say reflect on Stockholm. I've been going to Stockholm for many, many years and giving talks and things there. And the question is, why not the U.S., I think, is strong. And my answer is partly counterintuitive. Years ago, I had an opportunity to speak to the African water ministers. They gave me 5 minutes to speak about the history of the United States and water. So what we did was we said, imagine a place, and it was all these basket case statistics, and it was real, and it was the Tennessee Valley. It really made a big hit because it talked in very tangible terms about what water resources does. The reason I mention that in this context is we aren't prepared, and we have not been telling our story. And it's not because the story is all pristine pure. It's just tell our story and what it has done. And telling that story is what so many people are interested in, and we don't seem to be equipped to have done it. That's one of the reasons it's been a failure in Stockholm, I think, over time. I don't want to dominate. I can answer some stuff in the others, but
No, it's good. But you want to make a comment on this? No, it's good.
I do. But
well, on the Nile, and I really want to leave these to Aaron because I don't want to get in trouble. And he's a guy. However, I will disclose that when the Nile Basin Initiative started, I was asked to be the facilitator for it. And everybody was really worried, so we were buried in Victoria Falls when nobody knew it was happening. We had all these people down there years ago. And that Track 2 process has actually grown to this more formal process that you're involved. And to answer the question, some of the important aspects of this are, first, it's testing in a very important notion. Can we bring people to understand that it's possible to create benefits on and off the river that are vastly greater than they'll ever have by even their most amazing plans of doing things alone? This is testing that. And it's still in process of testing, and it's really very, very important. It also tests the track 2 notions and what that means. And the jury isn't in on it, but it's something important to watch. Africa, you know that we've only studied less than 95% of the potential of storage in Africa. And this is the mechanism that allows that management of uncertainty, as well as the generation of hydroelectric power, as well as navigation, several of these rivers. The Japanese studied in the Niger, for example, and with very little improvements, they have 3,000 kilometers of navigation. So it's a big story, and it's a very important story. And it's not a story of let's give away a big check of money. It's a story of let's create a process whereby people are investing in things that are going to generate revenues and they get themselves moving.
Sure. I wanted to pick up on the second question regarding water transfer schemes, water storage, water transfer schemes. And I think that's actually an incredibly important question in so many countries today. There's a real big debate right now between supply side solutions, kind of investing in more water storage. How do you capture water? How do you transfer water? You think of these major water basin transfer schemes in China or India. And demand-side solutions. Much greater investment in increasing the efficiency, the productivity of existing water. And the point I want to make is that historically, a lot of the emphasis has been on the former. But I think looking over the next 20, 30 years, we need to see a lot more emphasis on the latter, on how we get more efficient, more productive use of water. About 2-3 years ago, there was a group called the Water Resources Group. Some of you might be part of that group here, but led by the IFC, by McKinsey, that did some of the best microeconomic work around water solutions. And one of their basic conclusion in that study was that about 30 to 40% of what we need to do in terms of to make more water available were negative cost, that they were economically profitable. There were institutional or other barriers why they weren't happening, but that they were economic. All of those solutions were about how to improve the productivity, the efficiency of water in agriculture, in cities, with industry. It's a comment I think Richard made earlier. And I just want to underscore that. I think that is a big paradigm change about how we need to think about water investments in the future.
Yeah, I would just echo that, and in response to the question about, can we build ourselves out of this problem? And I've spent a lot of my career working in California, where we have relatively water-rich north and scarcer water supplies in the south. And in many projects, we often get a proposed, alternative. Can't we just tow an iceberg, from Alaska? They're constantly offering us iceberg, although less and less these days because they have less and less. But really, when thinking about these, these alternatives, it's just like you said. We really have to look at the full cost. And water conservation and efficiency, more often than not, turns out to be the cheapest alternative, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of environmental costs as well, when you look at the full life cycle of costs.
General Engel, in terms of the question asked by Prince Selassie, really the whole question comes down to the fact that is the intelligence community, are the individuals in the services making these potential conflicts something of interest in terms of their reporting and what they're looking at, or have we not yet achieved that level of salience where they're saying this is something that can be a conflict starter, and what can we do to prevent it?
I won't discuss any specific region.
Understood.
So I won't use the Nile as an example, but I'll answer your question on principle, and the answer is yes. There is reporting to the senior levels of the U.S. government on where we see water issues potentially either degrading economic development near term, creating a humanitarian crisis, or potentially being seen for conflict. And that is one of the additional benefits that has come out of this particular study, is an increased sensitivity, and now it's institutionalized within the intelligence community, I'm pleased to say.
Excellent. Well, I mean, again, you watch the whole evolution of the human rights movement to put in the State Department coordinators for human rights reporting, and you saw that evolve from a very narrow report the first couple of years to one that has now become an important part of American foreign policy. So I'm hoping we'll on the same trajectory with water.
I think you've seen that. I think you've seen that same institutionalization of the issue play out. I mean, again, I look around the room and I look at all the different water people. Up in the corner is Doug Walker, who's from a regional bureau, but who brings in water expertise. I mean, that's something that was unheard of years ago when we talked about these issues within the State Department. Now you're seeing water people engaged at almost every level throughout the buildings. It's great. It's good to see.
It's good. Questions? Yes, sir. Well, I think this young man here had a question first, and then we'll go.
Thank you.
Would you identify yourself, please?
Certainly. Major Chris Upchurch, U.S. Army Reserve, 354th Civil Affairs Brigade. First, I'd like to thank the panel for your insights this morning, and I'd like to ask a question with a bit of a shorter time horizon. Specifically, what are your thoughts on the impact on potential conflict of population movements, and specifically quick onset population movements into areas of current water scarcity? And I'm thinking specifically in recent years, the Sahel, Horn of Africa, and of course right now in the Levant. Thank you.
Thanks. Right back here.
Yes, Fred Tipson, Institute of Peace. I'd like to speak up for the alarmists for the worst case. I'm the guy that used that cute Chicken Little What I Cried Wolf phrase, but I'd like to speak up for Thomas Malthus, because to me, the scale of the problem that we're facing in particular parts of the world is far beyond anything that historically that we've been dealing with in recent years. Pakistan's going to add 60 million people in the next generation. Nigeria is going to double in size in the next generation. Egypt is going to add 20 million people to a society that's already stressed. His history is not a very good guide to this kinds of problems that that's going to create, particularly in a world where increasingly political capacity seems to be, governments seem to be unable to do the things that they should be able to do. We're all coming up with solutions to the problems, but the realism of actually being able to implement those solutions to me seems wildly unrealistic. So it seems to me important that at least we have the worst cases in mind from a national security point of view to anticipate the kind of catastrophic impacts that these trends could have. Hopefully that will stimulate political change so that we'll begin to address these issues with the urgency necessary to really get to the bottom of them. But without that, I see no prospect that politicians are going to be able to cope with the scale of the problems that we're facing.
Thank you very much. Over here, yes, this young lady right here.
Thank you. My name is Swati Viravalli from the Army Corps of Engineers. And I had a quick question for the panelists on climate security and this concept of integrating climate security in with conflict prevention and water security. Specifically, I think all of you mentioned integrated water resource management, but how is it feasible to integrate climate security when the timescales, sort of the impacts of climate change, aren't going to be experienced in the same time that development projects and water projects are carried out? So the reliance on infrastructure and adaptive capacity that Dr. Briscoe mentioned, how can we sort of integrate that a little bit better? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. With those three questions, would you like to start out with General Engel? Why don't you start out with the first question in regard to, if you can. I'm just saying, I've been
all right,
running a number.
I'll start out in terms of principles. How about that?
Okay, that's good.
We do look at the issues near term as it relates to water issues. What we have generally seen is that, remember, I describe water problems as flood, contamination, or drought. And some of those, back to the last question about climate, some of those are extreme weather events. And our observation is that we really are seeing an increase in extreme weather events globally, and therefore we should expect more of what comes from those, which would include water stresses near term. And we have indeed tried to alert the policy community that that should be on their radar and they should expect that. Now, in terms of I think related to that, kind of the middle question that was asked about maybe the situation is worse than we say from a strategic point of view, my answer to that would be, it's worse in the context that we can't get the political system to respond. But if the political system does respond, I am more optimistic through things like virtual trade. We will be able to work our way through that. However, comma, and I said that when I quoted the one key judgment that dealt about perhaps a more difficult future, that only works if you have a global system where all actors in the system have something they can sell. If I'm water deprived and I have nothing I can take to the global markets to get money to import water, virtually or otherwise, I'm in deep trouble. And that's what concerns me. It's not the water per se, it's the absence of development which results in a society or a significant portion of the world that has a deficiency in natural resources has nothing to take to the global markets. And the population is growing unbounded, in an unbounded way. I think that is just a witch's brew that will ultimately end up with significant instability and conflict, one way or another.
Let me just add, I've been working on programs in Africa for the last 4 years, and a lot of the questions that have come up, and obviously one of our first priorities at the National Defense University, ACSS, is the question of conflict. And when you look at the water problems that have occurred in the Horn of Africa, when you look at the water problems that have occurred in the Sahel, you see that there is this common denominator coming up again and again. The diminishment of Lake Chad, for example, down to 5% of its size, what it was 25 years ago, also caused the population movement across the Sahel, people migrating to new areas. And those population movements have been accompanied by, I think, a great deal of displacement in the communities where these individuals go. So we are seeing that there is a clear tendency on the part of water shortages as part of a larger political process. But we're also seeing, in terms of the African states, a recognition for the first time. And that's the second part of this whole movement that we're all part of here today, is getting the African states and the Asian states and those countries that are facing these challenges to build the kind of coalitions that are necessary, not just with governments and building the political will, but also what we can work with in terms of the private sector and what we can do in terms of building infrastructure that is going to solve some of these problems. So, yes, go ahead.
I wanted to say one additional thing, and what you said there about people moving kind of triggered my thought process. When we did the Climate Change National Intelligence Assessment in 2008, we came away with that looking at 4 principal drivers where climate change would impact national security. Water problems that would cause people to move, food problems that would cause people either to move or become a serious humanitarian crisis, damage to valuable infrastructure caused by extreme weather events, mostly a problem in the developed world. And the last one was movements of disease vectors, either human disease vectors, plants, or animals. And if you look at those, and you look at those in the context of climate change, there really is a considerable amount of interconnection among these topics. And therefore, when we elected, after we did the climate change study, to go start looking at water, food, disease patterns, kind of individually, and say, but we know these are connected, and weave the climate signal into each of those individual items. And we've now subsequently added energy, which is critical for development. And it really is the intersection of these natural resources that are necessary for human sustainability. And what you're really talking about is what threatens human sustainability, and it's a byproduct of how these all interrelate with one another. And I would only encourage us, as we think about water, don't lose sight of all the other piece parts that water touches, not the least of which is health.
On the climate change question, I will ask Manish and Jerry.
Well, I had a couple of general responses. You know, Rich, what you just said, those of us who work in the water community don't necessarily have that problem because all these other sectors are making demands on water, and they're telling the water manager, give us the water. So the water managers tend to be the ones sitting there saying, wait a minute, there's a problem. We can't do everything at once. So there's not a danger. Maybe the other sectors, no, I'm being cute, but that nexus is really important. I'd agree with it. On the, some of this question about this dialogue, the rich and, I would say rich and poor and wealthy, the real problem is, I think, that very well-meaning people, us and others, are going out often into the world making prescriptions to people about what they should be doing based on what we need now in our country. What we need in our country may be very useful and important. It may not be what people who don't have anything to conserve need at this point. So what can we do? What we do is we talk to them about what we did when we were poor with the water, but also what it cost after 40 or 50 years, environmental and other costs. Yeah. So that we can integrate that costs with servicing those needs as opposed to starting to prescribe what we have to do based on what our what's happening in our own country at this particular time. I think that's a very important aspect of this dialogue. And I spent a lot of time with ministers of water in Africa, lots of other places, and I hear this coming back. So I'm not just spouting this off the top of my head on it. The alarmists, well, actually, I detect a little bit of optimism in there that you can change people. You're going to do this because you really have a faith that somehow it's going to make people change. Well, you know, if we were 1850 and we're sitting around in farms and we had the technology we had and people and they're making these projections, we'd all be dead. A lot of things intervened that we couldn't predict. The human creativity that came with this and the rest of it. And you know, I can't prove that's going to happen with the trends extrapolation, but I do think history is important in terms of how humans have responded and what they can do in their own creativity. It's a little more complicated. I'm not opposed to telling the big stories. You know, it gets us more work at one level, but I think there is a problem if you cry wolf too much to people and nothing. The things you say don't necessarily happen.
Sure. Two points. One, the first one about climate, the climate impacts. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious to all in the room about just how significant the relationship is between kind of climate change and water. Just listening to your 4 points about water, food, health, and infrastructure. The food and the infrastructure are mediated through water, and to a lesser extent health. So water is really at the center of a lot of how climate will manifest itself onto the world. And I think the thing that concerns me a bit about this is despite some positive kind of momentum nationally and globally on trying to tackle climate, the challenge is if you actually go back to previous IPCC studies, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you look at the different models that the scenarios that they modeled about what would happen to greenhouse gas emissions, the reality is where we are today is more pessimistic than most pessimistic models that they put forward. That, you know, much of the impacts, a lot of the things that we've heard really were premised upon 2 degrees of warming. But if you look at actual current commitments that have been made around the world, we're actually on a trajectory that is closer to 4 degrees of warming. And at 4 degrees, you get into nonlinearities, you get into wildcards, you get into a lot of stuff that it becomes quite challenging to fully appreciate what the impacts of climate will then be on water and then on those issues that the general outlined. So just a real important thing that if we want to tackle the water crisis, we have to tackle the climate crisis. The other quick point I'd like to make is just about this debate between the Malthusians and the pragmatists, which is I think I agree kind of with both at some level in that the scale is going to be unprecedented in terms of what we see some of these countries confronting in the next 20, 30 years. But the thing that I get a bit of optimism about is that the issue of water is now front and center on the economic and political agenda like it never has before. The World Economic Forum does this annual global risk report. 1,000 CEOs and other kind of industry and kind of civil society leaders around the world survey every year. What are the biggest global risks facing the economy? Only 2 risks scored in the top 5 for both likelihood and impact. Chronic fiscal imbalances, and water supply crisis. So the point being that this is becoming for the first time front and center in the minds of a lot of economic decision makers. And so there is much greater awareness about this. The challenge is how do you translate that awareness into positive political action? Because the biggest challenge we have is the issue of political will for most of these issues. But how you translate that awareness into real positive action, political action, I think is what the next 5 years is about.
So the other models or the other projections that they're being offered in terms of a 4-degree change, Are those being built into what the consequences are in terms of extreme weather that are going to be impacting us in the near future? And has the commercial sector kept up with technological changes and adaptations that can deal with that as well? I mean, I know the Netherlands went from doing a 100-year water cycle to a 1,000-year water cycle is what they're looking at now in terms of predictability. Is everyone moving in that direction?
No, but they are starting, we'll start to need to. I mean, this is about how you make decision makings under uncertainty. I mean, London had this interesting thing around the Thames Bridge, which kind of is just how to address potential sea level rise and storms from the Thames River, and how you begin to build infrastructure that can withstand a range of different climate scenarios. In terms of what is going to happen, I mean, I think one of the things is the next report of the IPCC is going to start to be released by the end of this month. It'll come in 3 volumes. The physical sciences later this month, in the early spring impacts, and in the late or early summer the mitigation. And that'll, in my view, be kind of the authoritative science behind a lot of the questions between climate and water.
Or do you have a comment? Just
I just
coming
have a
from
comment,
California, they've already gone through this on a microcosmic scale.
I know. Well, I'll just make the comment that the models that we're building that do integrate these various, food, water, and energy are integrating the most recent climate science coming out of IPCC as it comes. But that said, it's a moving target. We all know that, right? That we're having to calibrate these models every year as we see changes in the climate around the globe. So we're trying to keep up, and we're trying to also create decision models that incorporate uncertainty, and that's a challenge for people to wrap their brains around. How do we plan for any one of multiple scenarios, and how much money are we willing to spend for possible outcomes that we're not certain about?
Jerry.
Glad you brought that up, because I don't know how many meetings I've been in with people, we say the third world, and they look at, yes, all this uncertainty. If we do what's being asked, there's not enough money in the world to deal with it. We've got to deal, how much risk are we going to absorb given how much money that we have? In our country, we may have what we call 500 years of protection around some cities, and we have a lot less. And we can't get any more money than that. I mean, the Dutch had 1 in 10,000 years for the protection in the North Sea. But if you talk to a poor country, how are they going to spend that money? But they know the floods are coming, and they know the droughts are coming. And they know that the reasons we're supposed to be concerned about climate variability and change, most of them have to do with water. So what are we going to tell them? We're not spending any money on the adaptive mechanisms from the investments in water that are necessary now. So what's the result? You go to the Arab world, like I did with the Arab conference and facilitated the African, and they say, we're going to build our own GCMs. And what does that mean? It means we're going to put realistic probabilities and risk and cost for us on these things. It's very practical. The problem is the risk is there. People need to have some adaptation now, and they can't spend huge amounts of money for something that, they don't have the money. And there's a serious ethical problem. If we're raising the awareness of water-related problems, which we are in climate and other issues, and we're not doing anything to help the people adapt to what they know is going to happen in 10, 20, and 30 years from now, we are creating a time bomb. That may be something that's going to create some violent responses.
But aren't the adaptive technologies, aren't most of the things in terms of dams and levees and catchment areas and reservoirs, those are public works jobs. There's 230 million unemployed people in Africa. You look at the amount of money that donor states are spending in Africa and where they're prioritizing it and where they're putting it. And I guess this is one of the biggest questions that I have is those kinds of things in adaptive technologies can be done, and they have the skill level and the educational level. And just like the Civilian Conservation Corps, just like the TVA project, it's going to be bringing all of these resources to bear on these ethical questions that you pose.
Well, I think people in the audience will have some responses, and I think part of our job is to speak about these things, but also to speak honestly about costs that we've incurred over time, so we can help in the design process now. But I think others, that was part of the first question, actually,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think what it comes down to in terms of like the civil affairs outfits, that's why I'm glad we're going to be hearing from Lieutenant General Talley. I think civil affairs outfits and the U.S. military has a great role to play because those individuals could be part of that assistance project, particularly in the 54 African states where there are 45 transboundary river systems, but I think there's only 2 major agreements that deal with river systems in the entire continent. So they're asking for help. They need that kind of assistance. And we could do that in a relationship with the African militaries, who are the most powerful institutions in those countries.
One more quick point, though.
Yes.
When we talk about these uses of water, it's not, we don't want to fall in the trap saying we're going to write some big check to do these big projects. Because these projects and the purposes in these projects, by and large, can generate revenues. The issue is how do you start things to get those revenues moving? The one thing that we have problems in generating the revenues in private-public partnerships really is about flood management because of the nature. But when you're talking about things like navigation, hydroelectric power, even water supply, and even now some of the waste issues and other things, you can start things moving. So this, unfortunately, when we speak about it, it's like, you know, we're not giving enough money. It's where we give it, how we're going to combine resources and financial estimates, and who's going to be in the package and so forth that becomes important. That's where some real innovation is needed.
We're just laying out the landscape now, so we'll let the next panels tackle those topics.
They got the answers. It's a good answer. Yeah, they got the answers.
Questions? Yes, right here. And then you can move straight across.
Hi, thank you. Adrian Cummins from New York, nonprofit Philanthropy Center. Naples and the world, what are we doing to protect cities like New York City? Simple question, but people drowned in downtown Manhattan during Sandy. Thanks.
Thank you. And young lady up to his immediate right, and then we'll move the microphone here. Yes.
Hello. Okay. Starlin Matheny with Citizens for Global Solutions. And my question is, do you find it difficult to convince developing nations that water security is a critical issue? I imagine that there are more imminent issues that take precedent, that those nations would feel they need to patch up issues like conflict, population growth, and poverty, especially considering that implementing change at the resource level takes many years of planning. Basically, do you feel that the developing world understands the severity of this issue?
Great, thank you.
Developing.
You had a question over here. It's okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm Alice Thomas. I'm with the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. I was glad to hear in the questions and the panelists address the issue of population displacement in this conversation. I just wanted to point out that, in addition to population displacement from floods and droughts, often water management infrastructure also causes population displacement. And we're seeing forced relocation often as a source of conflict in the context of dams. I'm wondering if water management, better water management is the solution to a lot of this problem, how we can better integrate policies and institutions to manage population movement. And in the context of climate, it brings into this issue of relocation, whether it's Sandy or what's happening in Alaska, some of the Inuit communities that are literally falling into the ocean. And right now the US doesn't have any proactive policies that would assist communities in relocating in advance of a disaster. So I'm wondering if you can address that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Members of the panel? We want to tackle these 3 questions? Post Sandy, New York. I mean, I think this is really.
I should ask our colleagues here to answer the questions about what we're doing in some of the cities. I could say internationally, I know that Japanese and others are really working hard in this. They've created this World Secretary General's Water and Disasters Panel primarily to give some visibility to the issues of water disasters, even though they're well prepared in other areas. But you're the moderator. I think you should invite some answers from our own people.
Well, we have General Bostick here who's more than prepared on a moment's notice to jump up and...
Actually, Mike Walsh is our expert on this, so he can back me up. But we're, after Hurricane Sandy, the Congress appropriated $60 billion for us to do work along the northeast coast. But more importantly, there was part of that money. Well, first $5 billion is what's coming to the core of what we're working on now. And we're making sure that the projects that were there are being brought back to their design level. And as we walked with Mayor Bloomberg, Governor Cuomo, and Governor Christie, as you walked up and down the coastline, where there was a core project, the homes and the cities behind them survived fairly well. So these projects are not significant. I mean, they're like beach dunes, there's the renourished beaches, there's the kind of things that provide some level of protection, really help those communities. So those projects are being rebuilt back to their design level. There are a number of projects that were authorized and they were unconstructed. The 127 miles of coastline that is on the New Jersey coast, most of that is authorized, but it was never appropriated in terms of funding. So that work is ongoing. Some of that $60 billion is going to help some of those projects that were authorized but unconstructed. The other significant thing that is ongoing is that both the City of New York and a task force that came out of the congressional authorization is looking to the future and looking at a long-term plan for how do we develop more resiliency in the Northeast coast, particularly in New York City and in New Jersey. I met with Mayor Bloomberg a couple of weeks ago, and he's developed his own study team and come out with some designs that he would recommend that the nation consider and that the people of New York consider. And we're trying to make sure that we're dovetail with the commission that the White House is working. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is leading that task force. We're a part of it. But this is really looking to the future. So there's an immediate corrective action that's being made. There's long-term. As you know, there were a lot of tunnels that were flooded. What the mayor's looking at is these balloon-type devices being put on the ends of the entrance to the tunnel. So there's some immediate correction that they're making in order to try to prepare for the future. But a lot of work to go. But I think we're looking short-term and long-term.
Thank you, General. The other parts of the question in terms of the issues of conflict and conflict zones and whether or not the African states, and again, I don't know the array of interest. Aaron, would you like to address that question?
You know, getting countries to care about the issue is one of the hardest challenges that I think we face, particularly at political levels. But also, look, let's give some credit. These are very complicated challenges, and they happen within a very complicated context. You have a country where access to energy is 10 or 15%. How do you go to that country and say, no, you cannot build this dam because it's going to cause your downstream country to lose water for some of its food production or energy purposes or something else? These are very challenging questions that get at the heart of a lot of what countries believe is their own right to development and their own sovereignty. Very, very challenging sets of issues. When we talk to water ministers, Jerry mentioned the African Ministers' Council on Water. In some case, sometimes you feel like it's a therapy session. I mean, the water ministers are some of the most, not necessarily maligned, but certainly arguably some of the most underappreciated folks, I think, within their own institutions back home. And they come to us and say, hey, can you help us make the case to my finance minister, to my development minister, to my head of state, that these are issues that really matter. And in that regard, our message has to be shaped differently for the audience. In some cases, an economic message works. That, look, this is costing you X% of your GDP. It's something you need to invest in to ensure your economic growth. In other cases, it's about, look, this is going to generate social unrest. You've got populations here, here, and here, and as this salinization problem begins to move through your country, those lands are going to become unproductive, those populations are going to move, you're going to have some stability issues here that you need to pay attention to. In some cases, in each different arguments, and so to be able to have that intellectual framework and make that case on a case-by-case basis, depending on which ministry you're dealing with, very, very challenging sets of issues. I think there are a lot of us who are trying to work those issues across the board, but I think it is the biggest challenge that we face, is generating this political will to take the steps that we need to take to address some of the challenges that are not necessarily urgent. And because not all the countries have experienced a Hurricane Sandy, which really motivated our political process. How do you generate, when we do have a very urgent problem, how do you generate the political commitment around a problem that is not necessarily right in front of us today?
Chair, just let me ask you too on the last point about the research that's out there, and maybe you too, Manish, that's out there in terms of relocation of populations and refugee movements. I mean, this is an extraordinary cost and a very disruptive factor in the planning. Is this something that you're seeing evidence of in the literature?
Yeah. I know you were smart, but you know, some time ago, early in my career, I studied the displacement movements associated with our early infrastructures in the United States. And we had some bad stories, and we had some good stories. And in fact, you can go to the Smithsonian and listen to the recordings of people, for example, in the Columbia River, before the structures came, and then how they felt about the Corps and others taking land and things away from them. And then how they felt afterwards. It's very, very instructive. So the problem is really that we get a lot of localized costs, meaning people in the area either have to move or they are impacted, but they don't get the benefits. Right. This is at its root a really important political problem. It's not necessarily a showstopper in terms of the technology, but it is a problem about the politics and the economics. That's where we have to work on this and discuss and work with people about mechanisms and methods. But the diplomats and others have to work with this, because this is really at its root a kind of a political situation. You know, there's a lot in the way, in words, in what we say in words. For the first part of the 20th century, or actually the first 2/3 of the 20th century, our US Congress, when it authorized these projects, mini storage projects, they called these dams and storage projects conservation projects. Can you imagine? Suppose I go into the world, your place, and said, hey, you want to build a conservation project, we're going to have this giant dam. You say, get out of here, you're crazy. But this was mainstream thought many years ago. So the use of the words and things change over time. But it's a serious question about relocations. You know, the whole reason humans started building structures was because basically we were people who moved around. We weren't sedentary. And over a long period of time we were moving. They started to build structures that allowed them to become farmers and people that became sedentary, excuse me. And these structures is what allowed a profound change in how humans settled and how we began to evolve. So this issue of displacement is very, very important. I believe the most important part of this is this equity issue that we just mentioned, localized costs and distributed benefits. That's something we should be able to help with.
I think it's one of the great strengths of what's been proposed here by the partners, is the fact that bringing in the private sector as major partners in all of this, you are going to get that pricing factor built in, and I think that's extremely important when you start talking about allocation and what are public costs and what are private costs in terms of governments doing these kinds of projects. It's, I think, a variable that's been missing from a lot of our foreign policy.
And you know, there are places around the world to look. Look in Paraguay and Brazil. Even with the situations that occurred around Lesotho, look at how that's being financed and cost shared. There are examples that don't have to come just from us to help with this.
Well, again, I mean, the president's proposed this Power Africa, for example. I think it's $7 billion. It's in a proposal to Congress. If you look at that in terms of what its capacity is for low-head hydro, right, and taking what is a very large resource on the continent and converting it to both water availability and power and electrification, and with microgrids being able to electrify the countryside. This is all very positive developments coming from the U.S. and the right people pushing it. I guess what we really have to ask ourselves is, are we really on that threshold of bringing all these parties together and moving to the next stage? And again, General, you wanted to make a comment?
The only thing I was going to say is, as we do these projects, we have to be very sensitive to the people we displace, because that can be a destabilizing thing in the country. And one of the challenges, and I'm sure Aaron deals with this far more than I do in the intelligence business, but states are not necessarily as representative of their people as we would like to have them be. Was that diplomatic? Was that diplomatic?
Are you referring to the United States Congress?
You have a job.
And so you go in and you negotiate something with who you have to negotiate, the state powers, but there really is not necessarily the effort to take care of the people who are going to be pushed out of the way. And you have to think about it from a total hydrological perspective, and including the people that are going to be impacted.
Very good point. Let's take a final round of questions here. And I would point out that I was in the Three Gorges area in China before they built the dam. And the local reaction to that was very profound. But
yeah, sure.
Again, the overwhelming power of the state seemed to have cured that. That was a super project that is not what we're talking about. In terms of the final round of questions, we have one here. And there's one over here. And then the gentleman, I think you had your hand up before, but please.
Timothy Towell, 31 years in the State Department. I'd like to follow up on some great comments made by Dr. Salzberg and General Engel and others about managing disputes on these issues internationally. What do you do about aggressive, forward-leaning, powerful nations vis-a-vis less powerful nations? You mentioned Brazil. What about a pseudo-superpower Brazil historically leaning on all of the neighbors around it? The Amazon, that great water asset of the world. You mentioned Itaipu, another one. You had that wonderful slide on the huge Colorado Basin. Everybody wants that water and takes that water, and our great allies, our wonderful Mexican allies, get a little trickle when it gets down south and drops into the Gulf of California. How do you politically, how do you deal with that kind of muscle flexing by the big boys?
That's yours.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, no, that's the second panel's question. Damn good point, but yes.
My name is Dolma, and I'm Tibetan from India. Quite new to this country, and nothing so cool like that question, on politics. But I think even, for example, being from a small village from India and being a refugee, as a Tibetan refugee from a Tibetan refugee settlement, I think on the bigger issues, I don't know how to address it, but I'm sure it's all connected and how the bad things spread out from small to big. So this is just a thought for you guys to make your researchers and your contributions more effective. How much do they think about, for example, I know we ask a lot of things from United States government and, from different parts of the world and from different countries of this world. How much importance is given to the outreach program to educate the ordinary people like us, I know it's not our burden or the United States government's burden, but everybody who is here today, if you know already, or if you don't know, and or just to hope you give a thought about that, because I think all the dissatisfactions and all these things not all population react similarly.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it does add up to the, you know, all these conflicts, or in other words, you know, they have groups, and I mean, now that we have internet and all that, so how they network, and you know, so I feel like I was a school teacher too, so I feel it's so important. I know it's the government has to spend a lot on different issues, but as an outreach program, as an educational tool, I mean, nothing bad behind, which many of us do accuse, and which is partly true sometimes, but how much importance is given by the, for example, here, Aaron is here, State Department, and to in other poorer countries, especially. Here we have enough resources, and if we take effort, we can learn a lot about what's going on in the world and how to check these, not proliferation, what should I say now, the spread of dissatisfied younger people. I mean, one reason I brought this question out is because I see a lot of younger folks here today. So just to, and also for them to, I mean, even if they belong to, let's say, oh, let's transfer our population or whatever, or my type or whatever, and then as long as they feel happy and, you know, lounge and eat and drink and whatever, stay in heaven or have a heavenly life. But according to Buddhism, we say that that's very temporary, and any time it will be changing. So just so that these will not be drawn together as a negative, what do we call now, atoms or molecules or whatever, to form a bigger patch to, I mean, add to the conflicts in this world. I think I'm kind of talking on a large idea here, but I think, you know, today's theme is about this one. So, and I'm from India, and we are from a small village, and we have all these things, dramas going on for a long time, but since now I get to see you guys and everybody talk so freely like that, I kind of feel not that ashamed to bring up the dramas that goes on. And I'm a Tibetan, and China is very big, and I know we think they are our enemies and all that. You know, I'll kill them any time I see them, but not so, because we understand, we grow. Yeah, really,
Okay.
because a lot of conflicts, right?
Institute of Peace.
Yeah.
No, it's okay,
So,
it's okay, that's good.
so my simple question: outreach program, how much importance is given, and if not so much importance is given, I know I'm not lobbying here, but I really urge you guys to pressure point that, you know, to your higher superiors, because anyway we do spend a lot, and I strongly believe in prevention rather than you know, remedy and all that.
Good.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, my
No, it's okay.
voice is shrivelly, so I hope.
Okay, I'm just
you know-
getting people flashing
Okay.
me that I have to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, and then we had the last question was over here on this side, I believe. Was there one other person? We have room for one more question, poignant. Back to RPI at the top here. Let's.
Thank you, Lawrence Freeman again from ER Magazine Africa Desk. The previous panel discussion on financing I thought was very interesting. If we go back to how Roosevelt did it, it was government credit. The whole TVA was government credit. We look to the early founding of our country with Alexander Hamilton. The canals, everything was built with government credit. So I think public credit financing is extremely important. I think the Western financial system is in horrible shape and it's going to get worse. So I don't think it's going to come from the banking sector. I think the government has a real role to play. We've seen this in Ethiopia with their dams and in Sudan with the Meroe Dam. And if you look at Kennedy, I mean, not only was he pushing water projects, but he helped fund the Volta Dam for Nkrumah. And that was government credit. And I think the other problem we have to think about, which I sense from a lot of people here, there's a certain amount of pessimism that's come in this culture over the last 40, 50 years about what we really can do as human beings. I mean, Kennedy was actually pushing nuclear desalinization in the 1960s. Now think about that to end the scarcity of water. So I think we got to think much bigger into the future than we have, and I think public credit financing is a very important role in this process. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. To the panel, who would like to lead in these three questions? Aaron Salzberg.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there to unpack. First, to the hegemon issue. You know, I think there's another factor that's beginning to grow on the international stage, and that's reputational risk. And I think what we're seeing is that even those countries who might be the upstream hegemon on a particular basin, the downstream hegemon is a slightly different configuration, but let's say an upstream hegemon. There is increasing, it's hard to express, but there's an increasing pressure to be a good citizen on the global stage. And it's important for us to continue to reinforce what a good citizen means. And what that means in terms of your investments, in terms of your obligations to ensure that you're not impacting downstream partners in a negative way, what it means to your how you look at equitable utilization and harm that you cause the research you do. This reputational risk, I think, is beginning to grow, and I think that's beginning to create some pressure on some of the upstream hegemons. Otherwise, it's one of the hardest challenges that we try to deal with and break down. Capacity building can often have something to do with this as well, too. As you strengthen the capacity of those countries that are in a slightly marginalized position, as their capacity increases, the level of the arguments that they use becomes more sophisticated, and often we see a leveling of the playing field that happens there as well, too, so that's important. You raised so many good points. The idea and Rich made this point earlier, too, getting local stakeholders involved in decision-making around some of these things is critically important. Access to basic services. I mean, we haven't talked much about access to drinking water, access to sanitation. Access to basic services plays a critically important role in making sure that people have what they need to do what they need to do. And that, too, does feed up in terms of security and stability, and it's incredibly important. We, in Stockholm, just to give you a little thing, for the first time, and I think Julian is here and some of the others from our team who helped set this up, in Stockholm we had the first conversation with civil society organizations on transboundary water issues and how we can work with them to better educate local members of the population so that they can contribute more to these processes within their own countries and how they might be able to do that kind of work. So I think the points you made are very good points and ones that we're trying to work on. Up at the top, you know, this is something that I've been very passionate about for many, many years, but in a lot of the countries that we're working in that are facing significant challenges, India, but even many in Africa, there's liquidity. You know, there's capital in that country that can be brought to bear on these types of challenges. USAID, through the Development Credit Office, has really pioneered some of these credit enhancements, revolving funds, loan guarantees that have helped take some of this local capital and get it to work in public infrastructure. And these are incredibly powerful tools with incredible leveraging capacity that really gets the private sector engaged in doing some of these things. You know, water is one of these things that doesn't return a tremendous, it's not like energy. So a lot of people don't see it as there's money to be made there, so it's hard to get folks involved. There are impediments to getting the local banks to lending in this kind of sector. Even the microfinance institutions are often reluctant to lend in this particular sector. Building the capacity of the local capital markets, providing some of these loan enhancements, critically important, I think, in getting lots of money working, and local money, not just our money. You know, I think AID has leveraging of almost 20, sometimes 50 to 1 in some of the dollars that we invest into the return and we can get in some of this local capital work. So a very important point, and appreciate your making that upstairs.
Great. 30 seconds closing comments from each of the panelists and the issues that have been presented. Jerry.
Quickly, thank you for the comment from India to remember about the people, because you know, I work with civil engineers. Civil is in our Western language. Civil, civitas, and you know, the reason we're in this business is to help people, and it's useful to remember that. The issues of government credit and so forth are a little bit more complicated, but you know, we're not all that bad. We have the Harmon Doctrine, okay, with beating up on the Mexicans, but we have the Columbia River Treaty, and we're jointly managing it. And we're now even storing water from Mexico in the United States, and we're doing the same in the Columbia for years and having transfers. So, you know, there's a lot of things beyond just the bad things we've done.
Thank you.
Hard to summarize in 30 seconds, isn't it?
You can do it.
I can do it. So I think the private sector has and will continue to play a really critical part in solving these problems, both on the financing side and in gathering innovative solutions and approaches to these integrated problems. But it's a challenge for us because, you know, many of these areas we're talking about working are they're unsafe and their funding is uncertain, you know, and some of the business practices are not so ethical. So we're solutions so that it's clear path for us to operate in a lot of these countries.
Maybe to continue with the theme on India, I was actually in India last year in about July, and some of you may recall the headlines about this great blackout in India that affected 700 million people. 700 million people for 2 days. And the reason for that blackout was actually reduced precipitation. In part, less water for hydro, less water for coal-fired power plants. But interestingly, the less water led to large farmers not having to, this was during the monsoon season, and they needed to get water. So they moved from expecting rainfall to using their electric pumps to actually pull water out from the groundwater aquifers. Electricity is free to large farmers, and that again created all this demand onto the grid that led to the instability that led to the breakdown. But the point I'm making here is just how interconnected these issues are, and how to deal with the water crisis, you got to deal with electricity prices, or you have to deal with cropping patterns. And how politically, I mean, coming back to India again, how strong vested interests and politics plays a role in how you tackle those issues. And so for me, a lot of what I think that the State Department and USAID have done that's been incredibly important is around the transparency question. It's around the kind of institutions and governance dimensions, because I think the only way to get the type of transformative change we need to see to really get solutions that are systemic and structural to the challenges we've been talking about is to change the political economy of these questions.
Thank you. General Engel.
Well, I would make the observation that we've come to the conclusion that oftentimes when we're looking at national security, it begins first at human sustainability at a very small level. Because in the absence of human sustainability, which involves everything that human beings need, including the ability to see themselves prosper and their children prosper, in the absence of all that, you start to have friction combined with a disenfranchisement from the political system results in social disruption, which goes to political disruption, and ultimately state failure and conflict. So the key is preservation of human security, which is an integrated view, and building a system that has resilience that allows people to really feel that they do have a future in front of them. And that's what has to be done.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank, Aaron, do you want to have one last word?
I think Rich just summed it up great. I would add, we're there. You might not hear about us, and often on these very sensitive transboundary issues, hopefully you don't hear about us. But through USAID, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the United States is one of the largest donors worldwide on water and sanitation issues. The launch of the USAID water strategy, which you'll hear much more about this afternoon, is a great step in reinforcing the United States' commitment to these kinds of issues. Diplomatically, I think we're engaged deeply in trying to support these kinds of issues throughout the world, and we're looking forward to a continued conversation with all of you about how we can do a better job on these issues going forward.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel. I would hope you would join with me in thanking for wonderful set of presentations. Thank you. At this time, I'm not going to give a full introduction to Lieutenant General Talley, although I do think he is one of the most enlightened leaders we've ever had in the United States military, and I can say that because I was in the Civil Affairs branch that he also emanates from, and as a retired colonel, I think it's important to recognize the great contributions that Civil Affairs have made and will make to the future of this country. But without any further ado, I will ask, and your more prolonged introduction will be made in the next panel that you're also on, and just tell you that he just flew in from Europe last night, where he was debating the great minds of Oxford and Cambridge and the British Parliament, and he's come here today to be an important part of this program. He has a short video for you and a few remarks. General Talley.
Well, thank you, John, for the introduction. As we say abroad, brilliant, brilliant. If I could ask everybody, if you could just stand up and stretch in place for 30 seconds, and maybe it'll stretch your bladders and you can hang in there for just a few more minutes. At least it might work. So just kind of stretch out and hopefully you can hang in there for a few more minutes. I know it's been a long but great morning, so thank you for that. Well, it's a tough act to follow this morning, but I want to make a few remarks and show you a very short video that shows some of the work that the Army Reserve is doing. But first, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for simply being here today, and a special thanks to our private-public sponsors for this summit. As it was already mentioned, I'm a citizen soldier, I'm a reservist, and in my civilian career, I've had the privilege to really experience a variety of things in the private and public sector. In fact, you know, I have somewhat of a good reputation as an international expert in water and sustainability, being an academic at 3 universities and operating in the environmental water space in the private sector, for-profit and also not-for-profit. And so it's great to see this group together. Before I talk about the Army Reserve, let me tell you why this summit is so important to me. The reason it's important to me is if you look at the global problems that we have, they can't be solved by the government alone. It's going to take the private and public sector, and I mean for-profit and not-for-profit, in the private sector to solve these problems. And at the very top of the list is the environment and climate change and water, as we've been talking about. And so to me, just look at the group that we have today. So as we try to militarily, from the Department of Defense, prevent conflict, which is what our goal is. If you're a combatant commander and you have to use the military in a lethal way, we've kind of failed, right? So to get the Department of Defense and the State Department and other great institutes like the Institute of Peace and our private sector to come together to prevent and shape globally, in this case particularly around water, so we can hopefully prevent conflict and never use our armed forces in lethal or kinetic operations, what a wonderful thing to see and do. And so, you know, here we're engaging our hearts and our heads, and I think that's what's got me so excited about being with you this morning. So why am I here as the Chief of the Army Reserve? Well, the Army Reserve is a life-saving and life-sustaining force for the nation. And I think if you think about it for a minute, water is also a force that is really, it saves and sustains lives. Now, the Army Reserve, it's a big organization. It's 205,000 soldiers, 13,000 civilians. We're in 30 countries, every state and territory. Most of those folks are citizen soldiers, and they work predominantly in the private sector in their civilian capacity. And then they come and meet the needs of the nation when the nation needs them. And currently, we're in about 30 countries, to include less than 10,000 now in Afghanistan. But many of our folks are experts in the technical arena. In fact, if you look at the technical enablers, what we call enablers in the Army, your lawyers, your doctors, your engineers, your logisticians, your financiers, anything that requires hard technical skills, they're not actually in the Army. Most of those support folks are not in the Army National Guard either. They're in the Army Reserve. And they work in those capacities in the civilian sector around the planet. And then they serve part-time or less than full-time in the Army Reserve to help meet the needs of our nation. Well, what I want to briefly kind of highlight you to is in the Army Reserve is we try to find a way to keep relevant and operational and use those technical enabling skills to prevent and shape so our nation can stay out of protracted conflict. One of the ways that I believe we need to do that is through an initiative that I've launched called the Private-Public Partnership, of which our participation in this program is part of the Army Reserve's Private-Public Partnership. We have, through our Employer Partnership Program, and the head of that is our director, Aaron Thiede, who's in the audience here. Say hi, Aaron. Most capable professional I've ever met is Aaron Thiede, and she's a former Marine, so Semper Fi and be careful. Hurrah. We have agreements in place with over 4,000 private companies, from the biggest, such as General Electric, down to the smallest startup companies, and they hire our Army Reserve soldiers and their civilian capacities to work for their companies because they make great employees and they have great technical skills and leadership skills. Well, we've expanded that employer partnership program to go into the private-public partnership where we take these companies that are global companies and now they help us grow the individual leader and unit readiness of the Army Reserve as we do great stuff, like maybe water projects in Africa. And in fact, the Army Reserve has been doing Title X training, where we train our forces around the planet as we build engineering projects, as we do water projects, as we provide medical readiness and medical support to areas around the planet. We've been doing this for about 30 to 40 years. And, you know, so this isn't really anything new to us. But what we've done under the private-public partnership is we've taken private assets and we've used them to leverage with the public funding that we get from the Army, which is actually very small. We're only about 5.9% of the Army budget and provide over 20% of the total Army to the nation. That's a pretty good return on investment. And so I think through this private-public partnership initiative, of which is why we're participating in the Water Partnership, you're going to see how the Army Reserves brings our assets to help support, in this case, in the area of water projects. And so hopefully we might have a few minutes for Q&A after this short film, but hopefully this will illustrate what I'm talking about. So if we could, roll them.
African countries are really poor in terms of epidemic preparedness. That's why I'm more than happy because the community now has got people who are technically aware, who know the diseases and how to prevent them.
This mission has a personal meaning from the point of being with people who really have great needs for improvements in their health care and improvements of their understanding of where disease comes from.
You rather prevent the disease rather than waiting for it to debilitate your people and then you come in. So it is better to prevent.
I hope you like that short film. We're just now getting our program. I've been working on this since the day I became the 32nd Chief, which is back in June of 2012. And I've got lots of help both within the Army Reserve and outside the Army Reserve. And so we're really excited to be part of this water initiative. I think there may be time for a few questions and answers, hopefully, because it's only just now noon, but I do recognize that you want to have your time to take a break and to have lunch before we get into the afternoon panel. I would say that when my private sector capacity, one of the reasons I founded an Institute for Engineering and Humanity was to apply social entrepreneurship to solve our problems. As I said, the global solutions can't be solved by the government. It takes the private and public sector. And so when I founded an institute that addressed the issue of poverty, and yet we looked at the billions of dollars, and yet poverty was increasing, the solution is not more money. And so I would propose you to think about social entrepreneurship, and I would argue through prevent and shaping, we can leverage and focus through social entrepreneurship lenses, and that's a way for us to perhaps be more effective in so many ways, depending on what your metrics are, at promoting peace and preventing conflict. So a little plug in there for social entrepreneurship. And in fact, that's what I was doing at Oxford. I had the privilege of being the commencement speaker at their business school, but also working an agreement. We just came to an agreement last night before I flew back this morning with the Entrepreneur Center at Oxford, which will now be part of the Army Reserve's private-public partnership as they bring in global CEOs who will partner with the Army Reserve as we do Title X training. For the lawyers in the room, we're not taking private assets. We're doing Title X training in the Army Reserve to leverage with the private sector as we help make a difference globally in support of our nation. So are there any quick comments or questions anybody would like for me? Because I intentionally didn't want to go long since it's been such a long morning already. Anything I can answer or any comments you'd like to make about anything that I've quickly shared? That means the bladder stretch didn't work. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. If you would, you're on lunch break until about 12:30. If you would exit to my left, to your right, and they have boxed lunches out there, and then we'll see you back for the lunch panel, which begins promptly at 12:30. Thank you.